Hey everyone! Welcome back to Game of Theories. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Jon Snow was reborn as Rhaegar's Trueborn Heir? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1. Fire and Memory. The first thing Aemon Targaryen remembered was dying. Not his own death, not this life's death anyway. He remembered a sword through the chest, cold stone beneath his back, and the faces of men he'd trusted looking down at him with something worse than hatred. Indifference. He remembered the cold, the way it didn't hurt as much as he'd expected, the way he'd thought, with his last conscious breath, I should have done more. He was 3 years old when the memory surfaced clearly enough to mean something. He was sitting in his mother's lap in the gardens of Dragonstone, watching the sea eat at the black rocks below the castle walls, and the smell of salt and volcanic stone did something strange to the back of his mind, cracked it open like a fist through thin ice, and suddenly he was somewhere else entirely. A wall of ice stretching to the sky. A direwolf's warmth against his legs. A girl with red hair laughing at something he'd said. A name, Jon Snow. He didn't cry. He sat very still and let it wash over him, all of it, the years, the faces, the battles, the bitter cold of the north and the bitterer cold of betrayal, until it receded enough that he could breathe again. His mother's hand moved through his silver hair, slow and steady. "Aemon," she said quietly. "I'm all right," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The wind off the narrow sea pushed at them both. "You've been still for a very long time for a child who is all right." He looked up at her. Elia Martell had dark eyes that missed nothing, warm eyes, but precise underneath the warmth, like a blade wrapped in silk. She had the kind of face that made men underestimate her and then spend the rest of their lives regretting it. Even at 3, he could see that. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" He considered lying. Considered it seriously, turned it over the way a man checks a blade for flaws and put it down. "About things that haven't happened yet," he said instead. She looked at him for a long time. Then she pulled him closer and pressed her lips to the top of his head, and she didn't ask him anything else that afternoon. That was how it began. By the time he was 5, Aemon Targaryen had the following things sorted out with reasonable clarity. He had lived before, as someone called Jon Snow, in a version of the world that had gone very badly wrong. He was now the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, Trueborn Prince of Dragonstone, and heir apparent to the Iron Throne of the 7 Kingdoms. His grandfather was Aerys II Targaryen, called the Mad King by the future that no longer had to happen, and the single most dangerous variable in every plan Aemon tried to construct in the privacy of his own skull. He had approximately 13 years before Robert's rebellion destroyed everything. He intended to use them. The trick, at 5 years old, was navigating the present without revealing too much of what he knew. Children were expected to be curious but not cunning, perceptive but not penetrating. He'd learned early, the first time he'd corrected a maester on the medicinal properties of certain Dornish herbs in terms far beyond a 3-year-old's vocabulary, that people became deeply uncomfortable when the gap between what they expected and what they got was too wide. His mother handled it with grace. Most others did not. His father was the fascinating case. Rhaegar Targaryen was not what the songs made him. The songs, Aemon had decided, were written by people who'd never actually met the man. Rhaegar in the flesh was quieter than his legend, more self-contained, with a habit of watching rooms from the edges rather than filling them. He was genuinely kind in the way that men who are never required to be cruel can be kind, which was to say, he was kind, but he'd never had it truly tested. He loved Aemon with the steady, slightly baffled devotion of a man who hadn't expected fatherhood to matter to him as much as it did. He also played the harp like the gods themselves were jealous, which Aemon found both impressive and faintly irritating, because it made it very hard to stay professionally detached about the man. The incident at King's Landing happened on a gray morning in the middle of Aemon's 5th year. They had come to court for the name day celebration of some lord whose name Aemon had already forgotten. The court was thick with those lords whose names blurred together, whose primary contribution to history was showing up and eating at the right tables. The throne room of the Red Keep was everything Dragonstone wasn't. Warm stone rather than black volcanic rock, colored light from high windows cutting down through incense smoke, the Iron Throne itself rearing up at the far end like something a blacksmith had built on a dare and a bad mood. Aerys sat in it. The first time Aemon had seen his grandfather, he'd been 2 years old, and even at 2 he'd felt the shape of the wrong in that room the way you feel a fire's heat before you see the flame. Aerys had been having a good day, by all accounts. He'd smiled at Aemon. He'd called him pretty. He'd pinched his cheek with fingers that were slightly too long, slightly too thin, the nails grown past what was normal. Aemon had said nothing and kept his face pleasant, and spent the ride back to Dragonstone thinking hard. Now, 3 years later, Aerys was worse. The whispers in the court were getting louder, not out of stupidity, but because whispers had been growing too long to stay small. The king had burned a man last month. A minor lord, some charge of treason, and the specifics were carefully not discussed in the presence of the royal family. But Aemon had ears, and the servants of Dragonstone talked when they thought the prince was asleep. The man had screamed for a long time, apparently, before he stopped. Aerys sat on the Iron Throne with the particular stillness of a man whose mind was running very fast in a very small circle. He'd had the good years already. Tywin Lannister's competence had papered over the cracks for decades. But Tywin was gone now, resigned in cold fury over some slight that had festered into a permanent wound, and without that buffer the cracks were showing through. His hair and beard were long and tangled. He refused the razor, some new fear, some whisper that the blades were poisoned, and his eyes tracked the room with an alertness that had nothing peaceful in it. Rhaegar stood at his father's left, composed and careful, in the way of a man performing a very demanding piece of music from memory. Elia stood with Aemon and his baby sister Rhaenys near the back of the room. Rhaenys was on her hip, already asleep despite the noise and heat, with the particular talent of very small children for sleeping through anything. Elia's hand rested on Aemon's shoulder, light, warm, the grip not quite tight enough to be called anxious. The trouble began with Lord Chelstead, who was the kind of man whose primary talent was picking the worst possible moment to say the wrong thing. Chelstead was mid-speech about grain stores, genuinely important, genuinely tedious, when Aerys interrupted him. "You've been speaking with my son," Aerys said. His voice was conversational. That was the worst kind. Chelstead stopped. "Your Grace?" "Rhaegar." Aerys didn't look at his son. He was looking at Chelstead with the particular focused attention of a man trying to identify an insect he hasn't seen before. "You spoke with him privately, 3 days ago, in the Godswood." Yes, Your Grace, we discussed the matter of the northern grain." "What did you discuss?" The room had gone very quiet. Aemon watched his father. Rhaegar's jaw was set, his hands clasped behind his back, and he was looking at a point slightly above and to the left of his father's head. A man keeping his face neutral through long practice. "The matter of Lord Stark's petition regarding the border villages, Your Grace," Chelstead said carefully. He was sweating now, even in the cool throne room. "Nothing more. Prince Rhaegar merely—" "My son," Aerys said very pleasantly, "does not merely do anything. My son is a great planner. Are you not, Rhaegar? A great planner of plans." "Father." Rhaegar's voice was measured, careful, performing. "Lord Chelstead is correct. It was a matter of routine administration." Aerys looked at his son for the first time. Something moved behind his eyes. Love and suspicion braided so tightly together they'd become the same thing, and Aemon felt the temperature of the room change the way it changes before lightning. He moved. Not dramatically. He didn't push past anyone or announce himself or do anything that would cause the court to turn and stare. He simply stepped forward from beside his mother, walked the length of the clear space between the courtiers, and stopped at the foot of the dais, looking up at his grandfather. "Grandfather," he said. Aerys looked down at him. Later, Aemon would not be able to explain exactly what he'd been calculating in the 3 seconds it took to walk those 30 feet. He knew that Aerys's paranoia was a hunger that needed feeding, that what the king needed in these deteriorating moments was not to be contradicted or managed but to be given something. A focus. A redirection. Not false flattery, which Aerys was too sharp even now to miss, but something real. Something that acknowledged the king without capitulating to the madness. He also knew that Aerys had a weakness, a genuine one, underneath the rot, and that weakness was his own legacy. The Targaryen dynasty, the bloodline, the continuation of something he'd built and feared and loved in the erratic way of a man who understood that dynasties were the only immortality available to kings. Aemon had silver hair and violet eyes, and a face that every person in this room knew came from only one bloodline in the known world. "I wanted to see the throne," Aemon said. He tilted his head up and looked at the Iron Throne with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of a 5-year-old. "I've been thinking about it. Meisters say it was made from 1,000 swords, but it doesn't look like 1,000, it looks like more." Silence. He could feel the room holding its breath. Aerys stared at him. The something behind his eyes shifted, changed direction. 227 swords, Aerys said. His voice had changed, not entirely, not safely, but it had moved sideways off the edge it had been balancing on. "That's what the histories say. I've never counted." "Could we?" Aemon asked. "A beat, too," Aerys laughed. It was an odd laugh, a little too sharp, but it was genuine, and the room exhaled around it. "You want to count my throne, boy? I want to know if the Meisters were wrong," Aemon said simply. "They're wrong about a lot of things." Aerys laughed again, and this time there was something almost warm in it. He looked from Aemon to Rhaegar, and there briefly was something that had once been fatherly pride rather than fatherly suspicion. "He's got a mind on him," Aerys said to no one in particular. "He does," Rhaegar said, quiet, steady, looking at his son now, not at the point above his father's head. The moment passed. Chelstead was dismissed without incident. The court moved on to other business with the nervous energy of a crowd that has just watched lightning strike somewhere that wasn't them, and the afternoon proceeded without fire. Aemon drifted back to his mother's side. Her hand found his shoulder again. "Counting swords," she murmured, low enough that only he could hear it. "It worked," he said. "Yes." A pause. "You knew it would." He didn't answer that. She didn't need him to. That night, Rhaegar came to say good night. He did this whenever they were at King's Landing, a habit from Aemon's infancy that neither of them had grown out of. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dim room, candlelight catching the silver of his hair, and for a while he just looked at his son with an expression Aemon couldn't quite read. "What you did today," Rhaegar started. "It was nothing," Aemon said. "It was not nothing." His father's voice was gentle but firm. He had a way of being gentle and firm at the same time that Aemon suspected took considerable effort. "You walked out in front of the entire court and redirected the king's attention away from Lord Chelstead and away from me. A 5-year-old. Chelstead was going to make it worse," Aemon said. "He was going to keep explaining. People who keep explaining to grandfather when he's like that always make it worse." Rhaegar was quiet for a moment. "How did you know he was going to make it worse?" "Because he was scared, and scared people talk." Another silence. Rhaegar reached out and pushed a strand of silver hair out of Aemon's face, an absent gesture, automatic, the kind that came from years of repetition. "You're 5, he said quietly, not accusatory, almost wondering. "I know. Where does it come from?" This, Rhaegar seemed to be selecting the word carefully, this knowing of things. Aemon looked at his father for a long moment. In another life, he had loved a man he'd never truly known, a man he'd found out about too late in fragments through other people's grief. He was not going to make that mistake twice, but he also wasn't going to lay out the full truth and watch his father's face try to process your son is the reincarnation of a bastard boy from a future that doesn't exist yet. I just pay attention, he said, to people, to how they move, what they want. Most children your age want to chase cats and eat too many sweets. I chase cats sometimes, Aemon offered. Rhaegar's mouth curved. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less like a prince and more like a person. Aemon had not seen him smile often, and each time it happened it felt like something being handed to him. Sleep, his father said. He stood. He paused at the door. Aemon. Yes. What you did today, he seemed to be choosing again carefully. Don't do it too often, not visibly, not where he can see the pattern of it. He paused. You understand what I'm saying? Aemon understood exactly what he was saying. Your grandfather is dangerous and you have drawn his eye and I am afraid for you. What his father was not saying, because his father was a careful man, was that he was afraid in a way that had been building for years and had nowhere to go. I understand, Aemon said. Rhaegar nodded. Left. The door closed softly behind him. Aemon lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the 13 years ahead. He thought about Robert Baratheon, who was now, a young man at storm's end, all laughing fury and easy strength, with no reason yet to march to war. He thought about Ned Stark in Winterfell, learning to be a lord, being good at it in the quiet way he was good at everything. He thought about Lyanna, who he'd never met in this life but knew in his bones, wild and generous, and so full of a particular kind of bright anger that she'd burned like a torch in everyone's memory long after she was gone. She doesn't have to be gone this time, he thought. None of it has to happen the way it happened. But he knew, with the particular fatalism of a man who had lived through it, that wanting a thing to be different and making it different were separated by a distance that could eat your life. You had to be precise. You had to be patient. You had to know which threads to pull and which to leave alone. He was 5 years old and he had 13 years and he had done harder things with worse odds. He closed his eyes. He slept. The next morning, Aemon was in the training yard before dawn. Not because anyone had told him to be. The master-at-arms of the Red Keep, a stout man named Sir Royce Anders with a permanently skeptical eyebrow, had looked at him last evening when they'd arrived and said, with the air of a man performing a legal duty rather than offering genuine information, that the yard opened at first light, and that Prince Rhaegar had begun his own training at age 6. Aemon had been 5 for 2 months. Sir Royce arrived to find the prince in the yard already, standing in the gray pre-dawn cold, examining the practice swords with the methodical attention of a craftsman assessing tools. Your Highness, Sir Royce said, with the tone of a man who has been surprised but refuses to admit it. These are too heavy, Aemon said, setting down the smallest one. For me, right now. He said it without frustration, just stating fact. Do you have anything lighter? I can use a stick if not. I'm not fussy. Sir Royce's skeptical eyebrow performed its fullest extent of skepticism. You're 5, Your Highness. I'm aware. Aemon looked up at him. I'm also going to be fighting in some capacity before I'm 20 whether I train now or not, so I'd rather start with good habits. Footwork first, I think. Footwork is the thing people always leave too late. Sir Royce stared at him for a moment that stretched well past comfortable. Then he turned, went into the armory, and came back with a wooden training sword sized for a child of 8. It'll still be heavy, he said. That's fine, Aemon said. Show me the grip. By the time the rest of the household was stirring, Aemon had been drilling basic stances for an hour. His arms ached. His legs ached. He was deeply satisfied with both of these things. Sir Royce, who had begun the session in barely concealed amusement and was ending it in barely concealed bewilderment, had stopped making comments and was just watching with the focused attention of a man recalibrating something. "You've done this before," Sir Royce said, finally. Aemon paused. He had learned to be careful with questions like that, the ones that were observations more than questions that were reaching towards something. "My father practices in the yard at Dragonstone sometimes," he said. "I watch. Watching and doing are different things." "They are," Aemon agreed. He rotated his sore shoulder. "But I think about what I watch. I think about it a lot. How the weight transfers, how the feet need to be under the center. How you can see a swing starting in someone's shoulder before the arm moves." He glanced at Sir Royce. "Can we go again? I want to work on the turn." Sir Royce looked at the sky, then at the prince, then at the sky again, with the expression of a man having a quiet argument with his own assumptions. "Again," he said. Elia found him afterward at the trough, washing the sweat off his face and neck with water that had gone from cold to merely cool in the morning heat. She handed him a cloth and sat on the wall nearby, watching the yard fill up with squires and knights beginning their own morning routines. "Sir Royce was at breakfast early," she said. "Was he?" "He looked like a man who had seen something he needed to sit down and think about." She paused. "How did training go?" "My arms are tired," Aemon said. He scrubbed his face. "It was good." "You know," Elia said conversationally, "when most children are 5, their primary concerns are food, sleep, and whether or not they might get to see a dog today." "I like dogs," Aemon said. "You're avoiding the implication." He lowered the cloth and looked at her. His mother had a gift for these conversations, for making them feel like conversations rather than interrogations, for creating the particular safety that made him want to be more honest than was probably wise. He'd loved her for it since he was old enough to understand what she was doing. "I just want to be useful," he said. It was true, even if it wasn't complete. Elia was quiet for a moment. The yard noise moved around them, clashing wood, called instructions, the grunt of effort. "Who told you that you needed to be useful at 5 years old?" she asked. Not accusatory. Just asking. He thought about Jon Snow, about what it had meant to grow up a bastard in a lord's castle, always slightly sideways to the life around him, always reaching to justify his own existence. He thought about how that wound had never fully closed, even after the wall, even after everything. Even at the end, when he'd been a king without a crown and a hero without a home, some part of him had still been trying to prove he deserved to take up space. He was not going to do that again. "No one told me," he said. I know what's coming, some of it, not all of it." He looked at her steadily. "And I don't want to be unprepared." Elia looked at her son for a long moment. There was something in her face that was beyond maternal worry, something ancient and considering, the look of a woman who had survived a court that chewed through people, who had learned to read rooms the way sailors read water, who had built her own safety through precision rather than power. "What's coming?" she said softly, not a question. "Things are going to get harder," he said. "With grandfather," he paused, "with a lot of things. I want to make sure that when they do, we have more options than last time." She was very still. "Last time," she repeated. He met her eyes, he held them, he did not explain. She did not ask him to. She was quiet for a very long time, and the morning moved around them, and eventually she reached out and touched his cheek with the back of her fingers, a gesture so gentle it made his chest ache with something that was old before this body was born. "All right," she said simply. Just that. "All right," as if she'd decided, without demanding explanations she wasn't ready for, to trust the strange, bright thing her son was, and to stand with it rather than against it. Aemon exhaled. "I'll need your help," he said. "Not yet, but I will." "You'll have it." She dropped her hand. She looked back at the yard. "But today you're going to eat breakfast, and then we're going to visit your Aunt Deria, and you are going to be 5 years old for approximately 3 hours, understood?" The corner of his mouth pulled. "Understood." "There's going to be sweet lemon cakes," she added. "I like lemon cakes," he said. "There's the child," she said, and stood. and he fell into step beside her, and they walked through the morning together like it was nothing complicated, like the weight of a future that hadn't fallen yet wasn't sitting on both their shoulders, and it was almost fine. Two things happened before they left King's Landing. The first was small. He encountered Varys. The master of whisperers moved through the Red Keep like smoke moves through corridors, present everywhere, visible when he chose to be, carrying the particular warmth of a man who had perfected the appearance of harmlessness. He found Aemon in the library, or rather, made himself findable, which was the more accurate thing, on the second-to-last afternoon of their visit, materializing between the shelves with a scroll tucked under one arm and an expression of mild, pleasant surprise that was entirely manufactured. "Your Highness," Varys said, "I didn't expect to find you here." "It's a library," Aemon said, without looking up from the volume on Valyrian dragon lore he'd been working through. It seemed like the natural place. Most boys your age prefer the yard. I was in the yard this morning. Aemon turned a page. "What do you want?" A brief pause. The pleasant expression didn't flicker, but something shifted fractionally behind it, a recalibration, slight as a needle's width, but there. "I merely came to return this scroll to its place. I noticed you were reading about dragons." "I'm going to ride one," Aemon said. "I wanted to understand them first." He looked up. "You've been watching me since we arrived." Varys spread his soft hands in a gesture of gentle demurral. "I watch everyone, Your Highness. It is the nature of my position. You watch me more carefully after what happened with Lord Chelsted." Aemon closed the book and turned to face Varys fully, with the uncomplicated directness of a child who had not yet learned to be subtle about confrontation, except of course that was performance too, because subtlety about confrontation was exactly what he was deploying. "What did you conclude?" Varys looked at him, really looked for a moment, with those pale, sharp eyes that saw everything and gave away nothing. "I concluded," he said carefully, "that Prince Rhaegar's son is a most unusual child, and that unusual children require careful attention." He paused. "Not from me necessarily, but from someone." It was a warning. A gentle one wrapped in silk slipped between the ribs before you noticed the incision. "Someone is watching, someone other than me, be careful." Aemon considered him. He thought about the future version of Varys, the man who'd said the realm with such practiced conviction, who'd moved pieces on a board whose dimensions no one else could see, who'd been serving something real under all the theater. He thought about whether that man was present yet in this one in any form and whether it mattered. "Thank you," Aemon said. Varys blinked. He'd expected something else, defensiveness, confusion, childish bluster. "Your Highness." "For the warning," Aemon said. "I take it seriously." He picked up his book again. "And I'm not worried about whoever's watching, but I appreciate you telling me." He could feel Varys' eyes on him for a long moment, reassessing, reordering, running the new information through whatever labyrinthine calculation he was always running. Then the soft footsteps moved away through the shelves, and Aemon was alone again, and he let out a slow, quiet breath. Good, he thought, let him wonder. The second thing was less small. On their last evening there was a small dinner, family, in the Targaryen sense of the word, which meant Rhaegar and Elia and Aemon and Rhaenys on Elia's lap, and Aerys at the head of the table on one of his better evenings, almost the man he must have been 20 years ago. He told a story about a hunt he'd ridden in his youth. He laughed twice at things Rhaegar said. He ruffled Rhaenys' hair with something that was genuinely gentle. Then he looked at Aemon. It wasn't the look from the throne room, not the restless, suspicious thing, the hunger looking for a target. This was something else. Quieter, older. "You counted the swords?" Aerys asked. "Not yet," Aemon said. "I was in the library." "There are 231, Aerys said. "I counted last night." He said it the way people say things they're not quite sure they mean to say out loud, surprised by their own voice. I had trouble sleeping. I went to the throne room." He looked at his hands. 231. The Meisters are wrong. They are about a lot of things, Aemon said. Aerys looked at him again. For one moment, just one, the thing behind his eyes was nothing more complicated than a grandfather looking at his grandson over a dinner table. "You're a strange boy," he said. "Like your father was when he was small, strange and serious." He picked up his wine. "Don't let them make you less strange, the ones who try." Rhaegar's face had gone carefully blank. Elia's hand had stilled on the table. Aemon met his grandfather's eyes. "I won't," he said. Aerys nodded once as if satisfied with something. Then he turned back to his wine and the dinner continued and the moment folded itself away. And that night in his room, Aemon lay awake for a long time, thinking about the man Aerys might have been, and the man he was becoming, and the distance between the two that could not be closed, and how much depended on what happened in the years ahead. He was 5 years old. He had all of Jon Snow's memories. He had his mother's trust, a fragment of his father's attention, and the beginning of something that might, with care, with patience, with a great deal of what he suspected was going to be very creative problem-solving, become enough. He thought about the wall, the cold, the sword in his chest. He thought, not this time. And somewhere below the windows, the sea broke against the rocks of Dragonstone with its old, patient violence, and the stars above were the same stars they'd always been, indifferent to the small, strange boy lying awake in the dark, making plans too large for his 5-year-old hands. He'd grow into them. He always did. Chapter 2. The dragon remembers the egg was black as a starless sky, shot through with veins of deep red that only appeared when held to direct light, like blood moving beneath skin. It was the size of a large melon, heavier than it looked and warm in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature or how long it had been sitting in the nest. Aemon had been staring at it for 20 minutes. "You're going to stare a hole through it," Rhaegar Martell said from behind him. "I'm thinking." "You're always thinking. It's deeply unnerving in a child." Oberyn dropped onto a stone bench near the wall of the dragon vault with the easy, boneless grace of a man who sat nowhere without making it look like he'd chosen the best seat in the room. He was 23, lean and dark, with the kind of face that made people simultaneously want to trust him and keep a hand on their purse. He'd arrived at Dragonstone 6 days ago, officially to visit his sister, unofficially because Oberyn Martell went where interesting things were, and had developed a theory that interesting things had a habit of clustering around his nephew. "The egg is warm," Aemon said. "Dragon eggs are often warm. Not like this. The others in the vault are cool, stone cold, some of them. This one has been warm since I first touched it 3 years ago." He turned it carefully in his hands, watching the red veins catch the torchlight. "Something's alive in it." Oberyn was quiet for a moment. When Aemon looked back at him, his uncle's expression had shifted, the easy humor still there at the edges, but underneath it, something sharper and more serious paying genuine attention. "You're 10 years old," Oberyn said. "Everyone keeps telling me how old I am, because everyone keeps being surprised by the gap between your age and your behavior." Oberyn leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Show me." Aemon crossed to him and held the egg out. Oberyn took it with careful hands, turned it, held it to the torch. He was quiet for a long moment. "It's warmer in the center," Oberyn said. "Yes." "How long have you been monitoring the temperature?" 3 years. It's getting warmer, slowly. But it's not my imagination." Aemon took the egg back and held it against his chest the way he'd found himself doing lately without deciding to, the way you hold something you've already decided belongs to you. "I think if I can get it to hatch, I'll have a dragon before I'm 12. Oberyn stared at him. "Before you're 12, he repeated. "Rhaenys might get one too. Hers is the green one in the east corner. That one's been showing the same signs, just slower." He paused. "Don't tell anyone yet, not until it's further along." His uncle was quiet for a long moment in which Aemon could almost hear the recalibration happening, the adjustment of a very sharp mind to the fact that the 10-year-old in front of him had apparently been running a years-long independent research program on unhatched dragon eggs. "Your mother knows," Oberyn asked finally. "Some of it." "Your father, not yet. He's been," Aemon chose his words with care, "distracted. That was one word for it. Rhaegar had been distracted for the better part of 2 years in the particular way of a man who had become convinced of his own prophetic significance. The song of ice and fire. The prince that was promised. He'd been spending more time with old texts, with certain septons, with that particular faraway look he got when the music in his head was drowning out everything else. Aemon had watched this development with the careful attention he applied to all potential disasters, and had concluded that the prophecy obsession was going to be a problem, not because prophecy was meaningless, but because it gave Rhaegar a framework for justifying decisions that ought to be examined rather than rationalized. He was working on that. Gently. It required patience. "Distracted," Oberyn repeated, in a tone that suggested he had his own opinions about what that word covered. He shook his head slowly. "All right, what do you need from me?" "Teach me to fight dirty," Aemon said. His uncle blinked, then laughed, a genuine one, full-throated and delighted. "Your master-at-arms is Sir Willem Darry. He's one of the best swordsmen in the 7 Kingdoms. You're already training with him every morning and apparently driving him to question his most fundamental assumptions about child development. Why do you need me?" "Because Sir Darry fights clean," Aemon said. "He trains for tournaments, for battles, for single combat between knights. He doesn't train for the situation where someone's trying to kill you in a hallway with a table and a wine jug and no warning." He paused. "I want to know how to fight when the rules are gone. You know how." Oberyn looked at him for a very long time. The humor was still there, but it had pulled back, the way a wave pulls back before something larger arrives. "Who told you I fight without rules?" he asked, conversationally. "Nobody told me. I watched you in the yard yesterday morning when you thought everyone was still asleep." Aemon tilted his head. "You don't fight like a Westerosi knight. You move like you're expecting the ground to betray you, like you're expecting 3 opponents even when there's one. And you use your left hand for things a right-handed man wouldn't think to use it for." He paused. "Dorne trained you different." Oberyn was very still. Then slowly he smiled, and it was a different smile from the easy social one, something older and more honest. "You watched me from the wall," he said. "You were there for almost an hour before I noticed. You noticed at 40 minutes. I let you think I noticed at 40 minutes, Oberyn said. "I noticed at 20. Aemon blinked. Then, despite himself, smiled. "That's fair." Oberyn stood, stretched, looked at his nephew with an expression that had completed whatever journey it was taking and arrived somewhere that looked like genuine respect filtered through considerable amusement. "I'll teach you," he said, "on 2 conditions." He held up a finger. "1, you tell your mother everything you're doing, not summaries, everything. She worries more efficiently when she has accurate information. And 2, Oberyn's smile went sharp at the edges, when you've grown enough to be a challenge, you spar with me properly. None of this holding back because I'm an adult. You come at me like you mean it. I'm 10. I'm giving you 3 years to grow into it." "Deal," Aemon said. They shook on it with the formality of men concluding an important contract, and Oberyn looked at the shaken hand for a moment after, with an expression Aemon couldn't quite identify, something fond and troubled in equal measure, like a man looking at a candle burning in both directions and unable to decide whether to be impressed by the light or worried about what runs out first. He was on sea smoke by his 11th birthday. Not riding. Riding came later, came harder, but on. Sitting between the neck ridges of the young gray dragon, feeling the heat through his clothes, the slow continental movement of breath beneath him, with the narrow sea 40 feet below, and the wind so loud it ate every other sound. Seasmoke had been named by the stable hands for the color of smoke over water, and she was not large yet, barely the size of a destrier from nose to haunches, but she was fast, and she had the temperament of a creature that found human fear both boring and faintly offensive. She'd let Aemon approach her at 9. She'd let him touch her at 9.5. She'd craned her great neck to look at him with one eye the size of a dinner plate, and apparently made some internal decision, because after that she'd been his in the particular absolute way of dragons, which was to say, she'd decided she was his, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. He'd smuggled her out of the hatchery himself on the night the egg cracked. Just him and the egg and a blanket and a lot of careful silence, because he'd known instinctively that the first bonding needed to happen before anyone else arrived with opinions and protocols. He'd sat in the dark while she broke free of the shell, piece by piece, and when she'd finally shaken the last fragment off and looked at him with those spinning silver-gray eyes, he'd said, "Hello," the way you say it to someone you've been expecting. She'd head-butted him hard enough to knock him over. He'd laughed, lying on the floor of his chambers with a newborn dragon sitting on his chest, genuinely laughed, the way Jon Snow had laughed, which was rarely but completely when it happened, and she'd made a sound low in her throat that was not quite a purr but was close to one. Getting her onto the battlements without being observed had required creativity. Getting himself onto her back that first time required a negotiation he conducted entirely through touch and proximity and patience, because dragons, he'd understood from the old texts and from simple observation, did not respond well to being rushed. She was his dragon, yes. She'd chosen him, yes. But she was also 40 feet of fire-breathing flying apex predator, and she expected a certain standard of behavior before she let you sit on her neck. He'd earned it. "That," said Sir Darry, emerging from the tower door onto the battlements with the expression of a man whose heart had attempted to vacate his chest, "was not approved by anyone." Aemon dropped down from the parapet, landing lightly. "She landed herself," he said. "I didn't ask her to take off, he gestured. She does what she wants." Seasmoke, who had folded herself onto the stones nearby with the self-satisfied air of a creature for whom the concept of consequences applied to other people, blew a thin stream of smoke from her nostrils. "Your mother is going to—" Sir Darry stopped, seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say, and started again. "Your mother is aware of the dragon. She's been aware of the dragon for 2 years, Aemon said. He started pulling off his riding gloves. She came to see her hatch. And your father, he knows. He came by last month." Aemon paused. I think he was trying to decide if it was prophecy or just good timing. I think he landed on prophecy. He said it without rancor, just as fact. "Sir Darry, I'd like to begin proper riding training before she gets much bigger. It gets harder as they grow. I want to learn her flight patterns at this size before I have to relearn everything on a larger scale." Sir Darry pinched the bridge of his nose. He was a good man, Willem Darry, one of the best knights in the realm, and more importantly, one of the very few people at Dragonstone who had treated the strangeness of Rhaegar's eldest with straightforward practical acceptance, rather than either superstitious awe or poorly concealed anxiety. He'd adapted to training a prodigy with the resignation of a dedicated professional adapting to unusual conditions. He'd adapted to the dragon's existence with considerably more difficulty. "We'll need a harness," he said finally, "and a safe area for early flights. The eastern cliff is probably best, good updrafts, clear approach from the sea, no one below." "I already asked the leatherworkers to start on a harness," Aemon said. 3 weeks ago." Darry looked at him. 3 weeks ago," he repeated. "I wanted to be ready." "Of course you did," Darry said, with the tone of a man who had long since stopped being surprised and was now simply tracking events as they occurred. Oberyn taught him with casual, brutal efficiency. Not in the yard, never in the yard, where the rhythms were formal and the habits were clean. He taught in the lower halls, in the kitchens when they were empty, on the cliff paths, in the narrow passages between Dragonstone's oldest towers where the stone was slick with sea spray, and the footing was bad, and you couldn't swing a full arc without hitting a wall. He taught Aemon that fighting was not a performance and not a dance, but a conversation between two people who both desperately wanted the other to stop moving. Again, Oberyn said, for the fourth time in an hour, from the flagstones where he'd put his nephew for the fourth time in an hour. Aemon got up. His left shoulder was bruised from wrist to elbow, and he had a split lip, and he was breathing hard through his nose. He was 11. He did not complain about any of this. "You're still leading with your right," Oberyn said. He wasn't even breathing hard, which was infuriating. "You've been trained so well with your right that it thinks for itself. When you're tired, it goes first without asking. That's the tell. How do you stop the tell? You make your left think too." Oberyn picked up the practice blade he'd dropped and handed it over, hilt first. "Your dominant hand is a weapon. Your other hand is a secret. Nobody watches the hand that isn't moving." He tilted his head. Again. Aemon rolled his shoulder, raised the blade, watched his uncle the way he'd been learning to watch. Not the eyes, not the feet, but the core, the center of mass, where actual movement originated before it became movement that the eyes could track. He came in lower this time, inside Oberyn's reach before the expected moment, and he did something with his left elbow that he'd been thinking about for 3 sessions. A short, sharp pivot that opened an angle that shouldn't have been there. He didn't win. Oberyn redirected him so smoothly it barely qualified as a defense, more like a conversation being gently corrected. But he didn't go to the floor. Oberyn stopped, looked at him. "That was new," he said. "I've been thinking about the elbow joint," Aemon said. "You can generate a surprising amount of force with a short movement if the geometry's right. I read about it in a text on Braavosi water dancing." "You're reading texts on Braavosi water dancing." "I'm reading everything." Aemon lowered the blade. "There's a Braavosi swordmaster in Old Town. When I'm older, I'd like to spend time there." Oberyn was quiet for a moment with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. Then he shook his head. "You know what I thought when Elia wrote to tell me she was with child? I thought, another Targaryen prince. Silver hair, pretty face, too much prophecy and not enough sense." He picked up his own blade. "I was wrong." "I know," Aemon said. Oberyn laughed. "You're terrible," he said fondly. Again. The sessions continued through the months of Oberyn's visit and then, by correspondence and Aemon's own disciplined self-training, beyond it. Oberyn returned to Sunspear, but he left behind a student who had internalized his philosophy rather than just his techniques. Someone who understood that the point of fighting was not to be impressive but to win. And that winning was an outcome that did not care about aesthetics or convention, or what the Meisters wrote in their books about proper form. It combined with Sir Darry's classical training to produce something that had no real name, but that made the Knights of Dragonstone's garrison increasingly reluctant to volunteer as training partners for the young prince. Aemon did not find this concerning. He found it clarifying. The ravens came in the 3rd month of his 12th year. Not the ordinary ravens, those came and went constantly, the normal traffic of governance and news. These were specific ravens, to specific lords, coordinated in a pattern that Aemon had been expecting and dreading in roughly equal measure for the last 2 years. Rhaegar was building something. Not overtly, not yet, but the correspondence, the quiet meetings with certain lords, the trips to Summerhall that were described as personal pilgrimages but lasted longer than private reflection required, all of it had a shape. His father was looking at the realm the way a surgeon looks at a patient, identifying the disease, mapping the damage, planning a procedure. The disease was Ares. Aemon had not told his father everything he knew. He'd considered it, turned it over, examined it from various angles over the years, and each time concluded that the full truth, I have memories of a future where your obsession with prophecy leads you to kidnap Lyanna Stark and trigger a civil war that kills our whole family. Was too blunt an instrument for the situation. Rhaegar was not a stupid man, but he was a man in love with the idea of his own significance, and significance was a drug that made people resistant to information that complicated the narrative. Instead, Aemon had been chipping away at the edges. He found his father in the map room one evening, bent over a chart of the Seven Kingdoms with a wine cup at his elbow and the particular concentrated stillness of deep thought. The candles had burned low. Rhaegar looked up when Aemon entered and straightened, gestured at the chair across the table. "Couldn't sleep?" his father asked. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Aemon sat. He looked at the map. His father had been marking it, small notations in red ink, castle names with small symbols beside them. He recognized the patterns. Lords who had grievances with Ares. Houses whose loyalty was complicated. "You're planning to move against grandfather." Rhaegar was very still. "What makes you say that?" "The ravens. The meetings with Lord Stefan's family. The way you've been corresponding with the Dornish lords through mother rather than through official channels." Aemon looked up from the map. "I've been watching the same situation for years. I know the shape of it." For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his father's face that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The look of a man confronting the fact that the person across from him understands more than the rules of the situation suggest they should. Then it settled into something more complicated, a kind of pained respect. "I'm trying to protect people," Rhaegar said quietly. I know that's what this is." Aemon leaned forward slightly. "Father, I need you to tell me what you're planning, the whole plan, not the edges of it. Because I have things I need to tell you, and I need to know where the seams are so I can tell you where they're weak." Rhaegar looked at his son for a long moment. Aemon had turned 12 2 months ago. By every external standard, he was a boy. By every observable behavior over the last 7 years, he was something that no one had quite invented the right word for yet. "You're 12 years old," Rhaegar said. "I keep hearing that." A pause. Then, surprisingly, his father smiled, the real one, the one that made him look younger. "I know you do." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. Then slowly he began to talk. The plan was, in its broad strokes, what Aemon had expected. A council of lords, a formal petition to have Ares step down in favor of Rhaegar as regent. Clean. Constitutional to the degree that anything in Westeros was constitutional. The details were more nuanced, months of careful groundwork, lords approached in the right sequence, the small council navigated, Ares's remaining supporters isolated. It was a good plan. Aemon listened to the whole of it with the patient attention he gave everything important, and when his father finished he said, "There are 3 problems." Rhaegar raised an eyebrow. "Lord Tywin," Aemon said, extending a finger. "He's not in your plan, which means you've written him off. You shouldn't. Tywin Lannister's neutrality is not neutral. His neutrality means the gold of Casterly Rock sits on the sideline, which in a contested succession is functionally support for the status quo. You need him actively aligned, which means whatever happened between him and grandfather needs to be addressed directly." He extended a second finger. "The North. Lord Rickard Stark is reasonable, but he's also proud, and proud men need to be asked, not assumed. He'll support a regency if you go to him properly. He'll resist if he finds out through a raven after the decision's been made." A third finger. "Grandfather's pyromancers." Rhaegar went still. "What about them?" "He's been meeting with them more frequently. The Guild of Alchemists for the last year." Aemon held his father's eyes. "I think he's been commissioning stockpiles." "Wildfire," Rhaegar said quietly. "A lot of it if the supply patterns mean what I think they mean. He's caching it beneath the city." He paused. "If you move against him and it goes wrong, if he thinks he's losing, there's a chance he burns rather than yields." The room was very quiet. Rhaegar was looking at the map but not seeing it. Aemon watched him work through it, watched the calculations moving behind his father's careful face, and he felt the weight of what he was doing, giving his father just enough of the truth to change the outcome without explaining where it came from. It was necessary. He'd made his peace with necessary. "How do you know about the pyromancers?" Rhaegar asked. "I have friends in the kitchens," Aemon said. "Servants talk, I listen." He paused. "You should start having someone reliable check the tunnels beneath the city. Just in case." Rhaegar looked at his son for a long time. "What are you?" he asked, soft, bewildered, proud, afraid, all at once. "What are you, Aemon?" "Your son," Aemon said. "Just your son." He reached across and touched the map, 2 fingers on the northern point. "Write to Lord Stark first, before anyone else. The North remembers, but it also notices which way you face them, front or back." His father looked at his hand on the map for a moment, then nodded once slowly. The conversation that followed lasted 3 more hours, and by the end of it the plan had been substantially revised, and Rhaegar was looking at his 12-year-old son with an expression that had moved decisively past bewildered awe into something quieter and more permanent. A recognition, Aemon thought, of the kind that only happens between people when the pretending stops. Late that same night, Aemon was on the battlements with Seasmoke. She'd grown. 2 years of good feeding and open, narrow sea skies, and she was twice the size she'd been when she hatched. Nowhere near the scale of the ancient Targaryen dragons, but large enough now that sitting on her neck with the wind taking everything that wasn't nailed down felt genuinely like flying rather than just perching. He'd done 3 full circuits of the castle at height, getting used to the new scale of her wing beats, the different lean required when she banked. He lay against her neck now, her warmth coming up through his riding leathers, and looked at the stars. He thought about the conversation with his father. He thought about Tywin Lannister, who he'd never met but felt he knew, that cold, brilliant, merciless intelligence that judged everything against a single standard of utility and found most things wanting. He'd need to meet him. That meeting needed to go a specific way. He thought about Lyanna Stark, who was probably 8 or 9 years old right now, and raising absolute hell somewhere in the Stark household by all imagined accounts, and about Ned, who was at the Eyrie being fostered by Jon Arryn and learning to be the kind of man you could build a kingdom on. He thought about Robert Baratheon, who was probably hunting and fighting and drinking in the good years before grief turned him into something else, and he thought, with a complicated feeling that had no clean name, about the future version of that friendship, how good it had been, genuinely, before everything went wrong. It doesn't have to go wrong, he thought, any of it, but he also knew, with the part of him that was still Jon Snow, that would always be partly Jon Snow, the part that had come back from death with no particular illusions about the universe's sentimentality, that wanting things to go right and making them go right were still separated by that same old distance, and the distance was full of things he couldn't see yet. He pressed his hand flat against Seasmoke's neck. She turned her head and regarded him with one spinning silver eye. "I know," he said. She made her low sound, the not quite purr. It moved through the bones of his hand and up into his chest. Below them, Dragonstone rose from the sea like a clenched fist of black rock, and the lights of the castle were small and warm against the dark, and somewhere on the other side of the narrow sea the dawn was already beginning, spreading itself across the water in colors that had no good names in any language, coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. Aemon watched it come. He had been preparing for 7 years. He had a dragon, a mother who knew more than she let on, a father who was finally listening, and an uncle who'd taught him to fight like the rules were optional. He had 3 years before the tourney at Harrenhal, 3 years before the chain of events that had, in another life, begun the end of everything. He intended to make those 3 years count. Chapter 3. The prince's game King's Landing smelled like it always had, river mud and horse dung and frying meat, and underneath it all the faint sweet rot of a city too large for its own drainage. Aemon had forgotten that about it. Or rather, Jon Snow had never known it, and Aemon had been away long enough that the smell hit him fresh as he rode through the gate of the gods with his father's retinue at his back. He was 14. Seasmoke was at Dragonstone. He'd considered bringing her. The optics of a Targaryen prince arriving at King's Landing on Dragonback were considerable, but he'd decided against it. Not from caution, from timing. There was a moment for that particular statement, and this wasn't it. This visit was about being underestimated, and dragons made underestimation impossible. He would have exactly one chance to be underestimated by this court. He intended to use it well. The city watched them pass. The small folk always watched Targaryens pass. It was a habit built from a century of dragon lords, the instinct to track where the fire was. Children pointed. A woman threw flower petals that mostly landed on the cobblestones. Someone near the back of the crowd shouted something that the noise swallowed before Aemon could identify it as either blessing or curse. Rhaegar rode at the front, silver and composed, drawing eyes the way fire draws moths. Elia was in the wheelhouse with Rhaenys, who was 7 now and possessed of an opinion about everything and the volume to share it. Aemon rode 3 horses back from his father, slightly to the left, and he spent the ride through the city doing what he'd been doing since he was old enough to do it systematically, watching. He counted the city watch. He noted which sections of wall needed work and which had been recently repaired. He looked at the faces in the crowd, not for anything specific, but for the general texture of mood, the way you read water for weather. King's Landing was not happy. It wasn't an open revolt, it wasn't desperate, but there was a flatness to the faces, an absence of the easy goodwill that crowds showed in times of genuine security, that told him everything he needed to know about the state of Aerys' reign from the ground up. He filed it away. He filed everything away. The Red Keep received them with the formal ceremony of a court that had rehearsed its welcome. So many times the warmth had worn off the performance entirely. Lords and ladies in their best clothes arranged in the order their station required. Faces organized into the expression their station required. And at the center of it, all the Iron Throne and the man who sat in it. Aerys was worse than 2 years ago. Not dramatically, not the raving, burning thing he would eventually become. Not yet. But the deterioration had continued in the way of a wall whose mortar is slowly failing. Still standing, still functional, but the integrity was going, and anyone with eyes could see the cracks if they looked at the right angles. He'd had one of his lucid periods recently, by all accounts, sharp and present and almost himself, which made the current baseline more visible by contrast. He smiled at Aemon. Aemon smiled back, with the complete, open warmth of a boy delighted to see his grandfather, and felt absolutely nothing complicated about the performance because he'd had 9 years to practice it. "You've grown," Aerys said. 2 inches since last year," Aemon said. "I keep hoping for more." "Father has the height, I'd like to have it too eventually." Aerys' smile widened slightly. He reached down from the throne and gripped Aemon's shoulder, a brief firm touch. "You'll get it," he said. "Targaryen men grow late and tall. Your great-grandfather was still growing at 17. He released him, looked at him for a moment. "I heard you have a dragon." "Seasmoke," Aemon said. "Gray like her name, she's faster than she looks." "They always are," Aerys said, and something in his face shifted, a private thing moving behind his eyes, some memory or grief that had nothing to do with Aemon. Then it passed. He looked at the court. "Well," he said, "we feast tonight." The feast was the court at its most compressed, every politics of the realm in one room, expressed through who sat where and who spoke to whom, and who very deliberately did not. Aemon moved through it. He had a specific list of people he needed to talk to tonight, and he'd mapped the room in his head before they sat down, noting positions and neighbors, and which conversations were already happening when the doors opened. The thing about feasts, he'd concluded years ago, was that people were simultaneously at their most unguarded and their most performative, the wine doing a gentle war with the social calculation, and the cracks between those two states were where actual information lived. Lord Mace Tyrell was easy, a man who wanted very much to be taken seriously, and was most easily handled by being taken seriously, which cost nothing and paid dividends. Aemon spent 4 minutes with him discussing Highgarden's grain stores and the Reach's unusually wet growing season, and Mace Tyrell departed the encounter looking faintly dazed, like a man who'd expected to be humored and had instead been consulted. Lord Jon Arryn was harder and more interesting. He was fostering 2 boys in the Vale, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, and while Lyanna's involvement in the coming crisis was the most visible thread, Aemon had long since concluded that the real knot was here, in the relationship between these 3 men. Arryn was a careful lord, steady, the kind of man who remembered promises. He looked at Aemon with the measuring eyes of someone who'd heard things and was assessing the gap between the report and the subject. "The Vale has had peaceful years," Aemon said. "It has," Arryn agreed. "Your Highness has been following the Vale's affairs. My father values your lordship's counsel. He mentions it frequently." It was true, and saying it cost nothing, and the slight straightening of Arryn's posture told him it had landed correctly. "I've been reading the reports from the mountain clans as well. The pattern of their movements in the last 3 years suggests they're being pushed from the high passes. Something's pressuring them from the north side." Arryn looked at him with sudden genuine attention. "That's a careful reading. Most people dismiss the mountain clans as random. Nothing's random. Everything has a reason, even when the reason is just hunger." He paused, let it sit naturally. "How are your wards, my lord, Stark and Baratheon? I've not had the opportunity to meet them." "Robert is." Arryn seemed to select an adjective the way you select a fish from a barrel, slightly uncertain about which one you're grabbing. "Energetic. He'll be a formidable lord of Storm's End." "And Stark." Something warmer moved through Arryn's face. "Eddard is the steadiest young man I've met in 30 years of fostering," he said simply. "I'd like to visit the Vale," Aemon said. "When it can be arranged. I've been meaning to write to Lord Stark at Winterfell about a visit, but the Vale might come first." Arryn regarded him. "I'm sure that could be arranged," he said carefully. "Good," Aemon said with the easy confidence of someone who has decided something and sees no particular reason to doubt it. He raised his cup. Arryn raised his. They drank. The conversation he was waiting for, though, the one that mattered most tonight, came from an unexpected direction. He'd positioned himself near the east window during the second remove, where the air was cooler and the noise slightly less, and he was watching a conversation between 2 of his father's advisors when a presence settled into the space beside him with the quiet deliberateness of a man who moves through rooms the way stones move through water, without resistance, without hurry, without announcing themselves. Tywin Lannister was 51 years old, and he was the most frightening man Aemon had ever been in the same room with. Not because of anything visible. He wasn't large, wasn't loud, didn't radiate threat the way some men did. He frightened because nothing about him was accidental. Every word, every gesture, every silence was chosen. Being near him was like standing next to a very large and very patient mechanism, and the frightening part was not knowing what it was built to do. "Your Highness," Tywin said. "Lord Tywin," Aemon said. He did not turn immediately, finished watching the conversation he'd been watching for another 3 seconds, because turning immediately would signal that Tywin's arrival had surprised him, and nothing about this encounter should look like surprise. Then he turned. Tywin Lannister looked at him with pale green eyes that had the quality of very old glass, clear but not transparent, letting light in without letting you see through. He looked at Aemon the way he probably looked at everything, with the comprehensive assessment of a man who catalogued what things were worth before deciding how to relate to them. "I haven't seen you since you were 5, Tywin said. "No," Aemon agreed. "I was at Dragonstone mostly, training." "So I've heard," a pause measured with surgical precision. "You have a dragon, Seasmoke, yes. And you train with Sir Darry in the yard and with your Dornish uncle in the corridors, apparently." The faintest note of something, not quite amusement, more like the intellectual satisfaction of a man who finds that his intelligence reports have been accurate. "I'm told the garrison at Dragonstone has stopped volunteering to spar with you." "They're busy men," Aemon said. "I try not to impose." Tywin looked at him for a moment. "You've been thinking about coming to speak to me all evening," he said, not accusatory, simply a statement of observation. "Yes." "Why?" Aemon considered his options for approximately 1 second. The standard approach, flattery, indirect maneuvering, the slow approach to the point, was wrong for this conversation. Tywin Lannister had spent 40 years watching people circle toward what they wanted with polite noise. He found it tedious. What he responded to was directness, because in his experience directness was rare enough to function as a form of respect. "Because you resigned your position as Hand, and you've been at Casterly Rock for 2 years, and that means Casterly Rock's gold and Lannister swords are currently pointed at nothing," Aemon said. "And I think that's a situation that should change." The room continued its feast around them. Tywin was very still, the way a man is still when he has decided to let something come to him rather than move toward it. "Continue," he said. "My father is going to move toward a regency. Within the next 2 years, I'd guess, though the exact timing depends on several factors. When that happens, the lords who are actively aligned matter more than the lords who are willing to watch and see which way things fall." Aemon held Tywin's gaze. "Casterly Rock watching is not the same as Casterly Rock neutral, and I think you know that. I think that's part of why the resignation still bothers you, not the insult itself, but what the insult cost in practical terms." Something moved in Tywin's face. It was very small and very fast, and if Aemon had blinked he'd have missed it. "You're 14, Tywin said. "I know it doesn't change the arithmetic." He paused. "Whatever happened between you and my grandfather, the slight he offered, the pride it cost, I'm not here to pretend it didn't happen. I'm here to say that those of us who aren't Ares II would like to offer something better, not a forgiveness of the insult. That would be patronizing, and you'd be correct to be offended by it. Just a different arrangement going forward." Tywin was quiet for a long moment. The feast moved around them, oblivious. "What arrangement?" he asked, and his voice had changed fractionally, something professionally genuine in it now. The manner of a man engaging rather than assessing. "One where Lannister gold and Targaryen dragons are pointed in the same direction," Aemon said, "which, historically speaking, has tended to work out well for both parties." Another silence. Then Tywin said carefully, "Your father sent you." "My father doesn't know I'm having this conversation." Aemon said it simply, without apology. "This is mine. He'll be told afterward, and he'll probably have complicated feelings about it, but the conclusion will be the same if you're interested in a conclusion." Tywin looked at him with those old glass eyes, and Aemon looked back, and the moment stretched out long enough to be a conversation in itself. And Tywin said, "Your father should be made aware that his son is conducting diplomacy at state dinners." "He's aware I talk to people," Aemon said. "There's talking to people and there's what you've been doing tonight," Tywin said. "I've been watching you since you arrived. Tyrell, Arryn, the 3 minor lords near the east table, and now me." A pause. "You have a sequence." "I usually do." "The Arryn conversation," Tywin said. "You mentioned wanting to visit the Vale." "Yes. Stark and Baratheon are there." "Yes." Tywin considered him for a long moment. "You're building something," he said, and his voice carried the recognition of a man who knew construction when he saw it, having built more things than most men dreamed of. Something larger than tonight. Aemon said nothing. He simply looked at Tywin Lannister and let the silence be its own confirmation. Tywin almost smiled. It was the barest movement at the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully arrived. "I'll consider what you've said," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Aemon said. Tywin inclined his head. Not a bow, not quite, but an acknowledgement, and moved back into the feast. Aemon watched him go, felt the tension release from his shoulders in a slow, controlled exhale, and picked up his wine cup. "That," said a voice very close behind him, "was the most interesting thing I've seen in 3 years." He turned. Varys stood at his shoulder, appearing from precisely nowhere in the manner that Aemon suspected he practiced for the pure theatrical pleasure of it. The master of whisperers had his hands folded in his sleeves and his expression of pleasant blandness firmly in place, but his eyes were alive with something that was closer to genuine interest than he usually permitted himself. "Lord Varys," Aemon said. "Your Highness." Varys glanced in the direction Tywin had gone. "Tywin Lannister doesn't have conversations like that with anyone. I know. He's been at court for 2 days and has spoken substantively with perhaps 4 people. You just became the 5th. He paused. "You walked up to him and said something that made a man who finds almost everyone disappointing lean in." Another pause. "What did you say to him?" "We discussed Westerosi history," Aemon said pleasantly. Varys looked at him with eyes that were doing considerably more work than his expression suggested. "You've been coming to King's Landing since you were 3, he said, "and in all that time I have never been able to determine precisely what you know and how you know it." He tilted his head. "It's a remarkable experience for me. Most things I can read." "I'm sure," Aemon said. "Tonight you spoke to Lord Arryn about the Vale's mountain clan patterns based on data that is not in any public report." A gentle pause. "That information came through my network, Your Highness. I've been careful about who receives it." Aemon met his eyes. "So you've been feeding me information," he said, "through the servants at Dragonstone, for years." Varys was very still. "I noticed the pattern about 4 years ago," Aemon said, keeping his voice easy and conversational the way you discuss the weather. "The right servants in the right places, having the right conversations within earshot. Very cleanly done. I learned a great deal." He paused. "Thank you for that, genuinely. It was useful." Varys looked at him for a long, evaluating moment. Something in his expression had shifted, the pleasant mask still there but reconfigured around a different posture, the way a skilled actor adjusts when the scene has gone somewhere the script didn't account for. "You used it," Varys said, not accusatory, almost admiring. "Of course I used it. That's presumably why you sent it." Aemon held the eunuch's gaze. "You've been assessing me for years, deciding what I am, whether I'm worth cultivating." He paused. "I hope the assessment has been productive." A long silence. Then Varys said quietly, with the air of a man reaching a conclusion he'd been approaching for some time, "I serve the realm, Your Highness." "I know," Aemon said. "So do I." He let that sit for a moment. "We should talk properly, not at feasts. Somewhere quieter where we don't have to be other things." Varys regarded him for a beat that stretched almost beyond comfort. Then he said, "I know a suitable room." The room was 3 floors below the feast, deep in the bowels of the keep, dry and clean and completely without windows. It had a table, 2 chairs, and a candle that Varys lit with practiced efficiency. They sat across from each other like men who had been conducting this conversation for years and were only now getting to say it out loud. "The wildfire," Aemon said first. Varys went very still. "Beneath the city," Aemon said. "He's been commissioning it for 3 years. The caches are in the tunnels under the Dragon Pit, under the Great Sept, and I think under the Red Keep itself, though I'm less certain about the exact location of that one." He looked at Varys steadily. "Know about it?" I know about some of it, Varys said quietly. The scale you're describing, he paused. How confident are you? Confident enough to be here having this conversation. Aemon leaned forward slightly. It needs to be catalogued, every cash, every amount, every person who knows where it is. Not to remove it, not yet, that would be noticed and it would accelerate the paranoia, but to know where it is and have a plan for it. He paused. Can you do that? Varys was quiet for a moment. Possibly, he said. He paused. The guild that produces it, I know, they have their own loyalties. But the men who move it are different from the men who make it, and the men who guard the caches are different from both. He held Varys' gaze. Loyalty fractures when the thing it's loyal to fractures. It's already fracturing. Your Highness, Varys said, and his voice had a quality it hadn't had before, something stripped of its professional warmth, something real underneath. What you're describing requires coordinating actions that border on treason, depending on whose definition you use. Yes, Aemon said, you're 14. I know exactly how old I am, Aemon said, and his voice was perfectly level and Varys heard something in it. Something old and settled and absolutely without the particular anxieties that were supposed to belong to a 14-year-old, and he sat back in his chair by a fraction of an inch. Why? Varys asked. Not why are you doing this? Something more fundamental. The question of what the thing in front of him actually was. Aemon thought about the wall, about Ghost's warmth in the cold, about Ygritte's red hair and Stannis' grim mouth and Daenerys' silver beauty, and all the things that had burned, about a chest full of daggers in the dark and the cold stone and the moment of thinking I should have done more. Because I know what happens if we don't, he said, and I'm not willing to let it happen again. Varys looked at him for a very long time in the small underground room with the single candle between them. Then he said, simply, I'll begin the mapping. The plot revealed itself 3 days later, as plots tended to, through someone careless. Aemon had been in the library, genuinely in the library, for once, reading a dry account of the Blackfyre rebellions because the patterns were instructive, when he heard his mother's voice in the corridor outside, and something in the pitch of it brought him out of his chair before he'd consciously decided to stand. He found her in the corridor with 2 of her ladies and a man he recognized as one of Lord Chelsted's subordinates, a small man with a clerk's shoulders and the particular expression of someone who has been sent to deliver news and is unhappy about the delivery. Elia's face was composed. Aemon had learned to read what was underneath his mother's composed face years ago, and what was underneath it now was a cold and steady anger. He positioned himself at his mother's shoulder and looked at the clerk. Yes, he said. The clerk looked at him, then at Elia, then back at him in the manner of a man recalculating the room. It's a private matter, Your Highness. There are no private matters between my mother and people I don't know, Aemon said pleasantly. A pause. The clerk seemed to make a decision, the way people make decisions, under the particular pressure of being looked at by someone whose eyes suggest the decision has already been made for them. He cleared his throat. The matter concerns Princess Elia's attendance at the small council meeting tomorrow. Lord Chelsted wished to convey that her presence, as a non-council member, might not be appropriate given certain items on the agenda. Aemon looked at his mother. She looked at him. A great deal passed between them in that look, quickly and efficiently, the way long practice enables. Which items? Aemon asked. I'm not at liberty to. The items that concern Princess Elia's household finances, Aemon said. Or the items that concern her correspondence with the Dornish lords. Which one is making Lord Chelsted nervous? The clerk's mouth opened and then closed. Both, Aemon said. I see. He looked at the man with the mild expression he'd perfected for situations like this, not threatening, not aggressive, just entirely, unbudgeably certain. Tell Lord Chelsted that the princess will attend the council meeting. Tell him also that if there are items concerning her household or her correspondence, she'll need to review them before the meeting today, not tomorrow, so that she has time to prepare accurate responses. He paused. If Lord Chelstead has concerns about that arrangement, he should bring them to my father, who is in the East Tower this afternoon and available. The clerk left at a pace that was technically a walk. Elia watched him go. Then she turned to look at her son with an expression that was exhausted and fond and fiercer than it looked. "The correspondence," she said quietly. "Someone's been watching it," Aemon said. "Not just reading, watching the pattern, who you write to, how often, in what language." He kept his voice low. "It started about 4 months ago. I noticed the seal on one of the returned letters had been broken and reapplied. The fold was wrong." 4 months ago, she repeated. "And you're telling me now?" "I've been trying to identify who ordered it," he said. "It's not grandfather directly. It's someone on the small council running their own assessment. Chelstead probably building a file." He met her eyes. "The correspondence itself is clean, isn't it? Nothing in it that looks treasonous to an unfriendly reader." "I've been careful," she said, with a quiet emphasis that made it clear careful was an understatement. "Good, but we should change the cipher you use with Uncle Oberyn. The current one has been in use too long." He paused. "And Mother, the meeting tomorrow, don't let them exclude you. Your presence at that table is not a courtesy, it's a position, and positions that aren't defended disappear." Elia looked at him for a long moment. She did this sometimes, just looked at him with an expression that wasn't maternal anxiety or maternal pride, but something between and beyond both. The look of a woman examining a thing she's built and understanding that it has become, somewhere along the way, much larger than the building of it. "When did you learn about the cipher?" she asked. "Uncle Oberyn taught me," he said. "Last year. He has 4 of them and rotates on a schedule." She almost laughed. It was the complicated kind of almost laugh that was doing double duty as something else. "Of course he does," she said. Then quieter, "Aemon." "Yes. Be careful about how visible you are." She reached up and touched his face, the gesture she'd been making since he was an infant, the back of her fingers against his cheek. "What you did with the clerk just now, it was right. You were right to do it. But you're becoming someone that certain people are going to want to understand, and some of those people are dangerous." He thought about his conversation with Tywin Lannister, about Varys in the room below the feast, about Aerys counting the swords of his throne in the middle of the night alone. "I know," he said. "How careful are you being?" "Carefully enough," he said. He reached up and covered her hand with his briefly, and she turned her palm so their hands were briefly clasped, and it was the kind of moment that didn't need words and didn't get them. The small council meeting the next day went exactly as well as Aemon had predicted it would, and exactly as badly as Chelstead had hoped it wouldn't. He wasn't in the room. He had no position there, and attending without invitation would have been a provocation without benefit. But he was in the anteroom on the other side of a door that had a very particular gap at its lower corner, and he heard most of it. Elia, precise and cold and fully prepared for every item Chelstead raised, turned each attempted pressure point into a demonstration of competence so thorough that by the end of the meeting Lord Chelstead was the one who looked like he'd wandered into the wrong room. Afterward, in the corridor, Rhaegar fell into step beside Aemon with the measured cadence of a man processing several things simultaneously. "Your mother tells me you identified the correspondence surveillance," he said. 4 months ago," Aemon said. "I should have told you sooner. I was trying to finish mapping it first." "And have you finished mapping it?" "Mostly. It's Chelstead, as I said. But he's not acting alone. There's someone on the council feeding him direction. Someone who wants to build a case." He paused. "Not against you, against her, against the Dornish connection specifically." His father was quiet for several steps. "Why? Because weakening her weakens the Dornish alliance, and a Dornish alliance with the crown makes certain parties nervous." He didn't say which parties. His father was intelligent enough to draw the line himself. "You should know about it, all of it. I'll write you a full account tonight." Rhaegar stopped walking. He turned to look at his son with an expression that had moved well past the complicated pride and the bewildered wonder of early years, and had arrived somewhere Aemon couldn't quite map, some territory between gratitude and grief, between being glad of what his son was, and some deeper understanding of what it must have cost to become it. "Aemon," he said, "how long have you been carrying all of this?" The question landed differently than Aemon expected. He'd expected something strategic. How did you find out? What do we do next? Not this. Not something that reached past the political and into the person. "A while," he said. "You're 14, his father said. "You keep saying that like it means something should be different," Aemon said. "It should mean something's different," Rhaegar said quietly, and his voice had something raw in it, not anger, something that was the shape of anger but made of something softer. "You should have a childhood, Aemon. You should be chasing cats and eating lemon cakes and worrying about whether you can hit the target at 50 yards, not," he gestured, a motion that was trying to encompass, "wildfire caches and surveillance networks and diplomatic calculations and all the rest of it." Aemon looked at his father. He thought about a lot of things in a very short time. Then he said, "I'm all right. Genuinely. I'm not miserable. I know things that need to be acted on, and acting on them isn't a burden. It's just what I do." He paused. "But I appreciate you asking." Rhaegar looked at him for a long moment. Then he put a hand on his son's shoulder just briefly, just the weight of it, and said nothing, and the silence was the kind that doesn't need filling. "Write the account," Rhaegar said finally. "Tonight. And then tomorrow morning we're going riding, just us. No agenda, no politics." He met Aemon's eyes. "I know you'll be thinking about 7 different things the whole time." "Probably," Aemon admitted. "That's fine," his father said. "Think about whatever you need to. But we're going riding." He paused. "A man is allowed to spend a morning with his son." Aemon said, "Yes," and found to his own surprise that he meant it without complication. They left King's Landing at the end of the week. Aemon rode through the city on the return with the sense of a man who has planted seeds in difficult ground and is uncertain how many will take. Some would. The conversation with Tywin Lannister, if it bore fruit, and he thought it would, not quickly, but eventually, changed the shape of what was possible. Varys, mapping the wildfire beneath the city, changed the shape of what was survivable. Elia's position at the small council, defended and demonstrated, was a wall that would be harder to chip away at now. Not enough. Not yet close to enough. But it was pieces, and pieces were what you built things from. He thought about the tourney at Harrenhal. 2 years away now, perhaps 3. The event that in another life had struck the spark that burned everything down. The place where his father had crowned Lyanna Stark Queen of Love and Beauty in front of the whole realm and set in motion everything that followed. He had plans for Harrenhal. He had plans for Lyanna too, though she was a person and not a plan, and he'd been careful in his thinking to remember that. She was 9 years old and living in Winterfell right now, and had no idea that somewhere to the south a boy with her blood in his veins was thinking about how to keep her alive and how to make sure she got to choose the shape of her own future. He thought she'd find that funny, if she ever knew. She'd always had that sharp, Stark humor, when she wasn't busy being furious about something. He let himself feel something then, the thing he usually kept packed away under the work, under the planning, under the endless careful management of a future that refused to wait. He let himself feel the particular weight of carrying it all, and the particular strange grief of being a man inside a boy's body, too old in ways that mattered and too young in ways that didn't, in a world that needed him to be something specific before he was entirely ready. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then he put it away again. He had work to do, and the work mattered, and the work was, in its own strange way, enough. The gates of King's Landing shrank behind them. The road south to Dragonstone unwound ahead. Sea smoke was waiting, and the narrow sea, and the black volcanic rock of home. Aemon rode forward into the afternoon, thinking about 2 years and what he could build in them. Chapter 4. The wolf and the dragon. The north came at him like a physical thing. Not the cold. He'd expected the cold, had grown up with Jon Snow's cellular memory of it, the way it lived in the bones rather than on the skin. It was the scale of it. The way the land refused to be managed, refused the careful human geometry of the south, just rolled out in every direction in great indifferent sweeps of pine and granite and sky that had been doing exactly this for 10,000 years before anyone thought to build a castle in the middle of it, and would be doing it 10,000 years after the castles were rubble. Something in him that had been quietly compressed for years expanded without asking permission. He was 16, and he was riding through the Wolfswood toward Winterfell with a retinue of 30, and he was deeply, unreasonably glad to be here. The official purpose of the visit was diplomatic. Prince Aemon Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne, paying respects to the Warden of the North, strengthening ties between crown and kingdom. Rhaegar had approved it with a careful political face that poorly concealed his relief, that his son had a plan for the Starks that didn't involve waiting for circumstances to force the introduction. Elia had packed him dried Dornish peppers and told him to make sure he actually ate, not just thought about eating, which was a thing she said every time he traveled anywhere. Oberyn had arrived at Dragonstone 3 weeks before the journey and spent those weeks running him through combat drills with a new intensity, as if he knew that something in the north was worth preparing for. He hadn't said so explicitly. He just pushed harder, corrected more, and on the last evening handed Aemon a slender Dornish blade, not a practice weapon, a real one, bone handle wrapped in dark leather, without ceremony or explanation. Aemon had understood and hadn't asked. The blade was at his hip now. The first sign of Winterfell was smoke, thin columns of it, domestic and gray, rising above the tree line a full mile before the walls appeared. Then the walls themselves, ancient and thick, gray stone dark with moisture from a recent rain. No banner flew in the dead air of a still morning, but the direwolf of House Stark was carved above the gates deep enough that you could see it from a quarter-mile out. He pulled up 20 meters from the gates as they swung open, and waited. Lord Rhaegar Stark came out on horseback with 6 men at his back, and the particular economy of movement of someone who has been managing cold and distance and difficult terrain for so long that waste has simply been bred out of him. He was a large man, not fat, the kind of large that was just structural, wide through the shoulders, steady in the saddle, with a gray-shot beard and eyes the color of a winter sky an hour before it decides to snow. He looked at Aemon with those eyes, and Aemon looked back, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Prince Aemon," Rhaegar Stark said. His voice was what you'd expect, deep, unhurried, the sort of voice that didn't need to raise itself because things tended to go quiet when it spoke. "Lord Stark," Aemon said, "thank you for receiving me. The north is," he looked out at the tree line, the sky, the stone. "The north is something else." Something shifted very slightly in Rhaegar's face. Not warmth, not yet. He wasn't a man who dispensed warmth early, but a fractional recalibration, the adjustment of a man who'd prepared for something and gotten something slightly different. "It is," he said simply. "Come in. It's warmer inside." "Is it?" Aemon said. The smallest possible thing happened at the corner of Rhaegar Stark's mouth. "Marginally," he said. Winterfell was everything its reputation suggested, and several things it didn't, the primary surprise being that it was alive in a way that southern castles weren't. The hot springs running beneath it meant the stones breathed warmth, and the people in the yard and the corridors moved with the purposeful ease of people who belong to a place rather than serving in it. The smiths were working. The kennels were noisy. Children chased each other across the yard with absolute disregard for the visiting prince and his retinue, and Aemon felt something in his chest, do a complicated thing that was most of the way to happiness. He was shown to guest quarters by a steward who was politely efficient in the northern way, helpful without hovering, present without performing, and given an hour to settle before the evening meal. He used 40 minutes of that hour to walk the castle. Not systematically. He wasn't mapping fortifications or assessing defensive positions, or at least not primarily. He just walked, following whatever drew him, past the great keep and the armory and the glass gardens whose warmth was a small shock after the yard, and he let the place settle into him the way places settle when you're paying the right kind of attention. He was near the godswood when he heard the voice. "You're going the wrong way if you want the stables." He turned. The girl was sitting in the fork of an oak tree 4 feet off the ground, which explained why he hadn't seen her. She was 13, dark-haired, with gray eyes that were currently assessing him with the frank, unimpressed scrutiny of someone who had not factored his royal status into the assessment at all. She had mud on her boots and what looked like the remnants of a sparring bruise on her left forearm. Lyanna Stark looked exactly like he'd expected and nothing like he'd imagined. "I wasn't looking for the stables," Aemon said. "What were you looking for?" "I don't know yet. I was seeing what I found." She considered this. She had a way of considering things that was entirely physical, head slightly tilted, one hand braced on the branch, her whole body involved in the assessment. "That's a strange way to explore a castle," she said. "What's the better way? Ask someone who knows it." "I prefer to form my own first impressions," he said. "The person who knows a place can't see it anymore. They see what they remember, not what's there." She looked at him for a moment. Then she dropped from the tree, landing lightly and well, not performed, just competent, the landing of someone who has been climbing things since before they could read. She brushed bark off her sleeve. "You're the Dragon Prince," she said. "I'm Aemon," he said. "I know what your name is." She looked up at him. He had the height he'd been waiting for finally, and she was still half a head shorter. "I meant you have a dragon." "Sea smoke, yes." "What's she like?" Nobody ever asked him that. Not how large, not how fast, not can she breathe fire, the practical questions, the impressed questions. What's she like? He looked at Lyanna Stark with the feeling of someone being surprised by a question he should have expected. "Opinionated," he said. "She has very clear ideas about when she wants to fly and when she doesn't, and they don't always align with when I want to fly and when I don't." He paused. "She head-butted me the first time we met. I was on the floor for about 30 seconds. Lyanna grinned. It transformed her face entirely. There was so much life in it, so much unconstrained energy, that for a moment he felt the weight of knowing what happened to it in another world and had to put that down quickly before it showed on his face. "I like her already," Lyanna said. "She'd like you, I think," he said. "She respects people who aren't afraid of her." "I'm not afraid of much," Lyanna said. It wasn't boastful. She said it the way you'd say I have brown hair, as simple fact. "No," Aemon agreed. "I didn't think you were." She looked at him with those gray eyes. He looked back. Some kind of recognition passed between them, sideways and quick, the kind that doesn't have a name but that you know when it happens. "The godswood's that way," she said, jerking her chin to the left. "If you wanted to see it." "I did," he said. "Show me." She looked briefly surprised, not that he'd asked, but perhaps that she wanted to say yes and didn't have a reason not to. "All right," she said, and fell into step beside him. The godswood was ancient the way very few things in the world were ancient. Not old in the way of buildings or institutions, which carried their age as weight, but old in the way of living things, which carried their age as depth. The heart tree stood at its center like something that had always been there and would always be there, its white bark stark against the dark of the surrounding pines, its carved face watching the still pool below with an expression that was and wasn't a smile. Aemon stood in front of it for a long moment. He felt something, he wasn't sure what to call it. Not prayer exactly, not the directionless spiritual feeling people described at holy sites, more specific than that. more like being recognized. Like something old and patient looking at him, and seeing both the boy who stood there and the ghost who lived inside him, and finding neither one surprising. "You feel it too," Lyanna said quietly. She'd been watching him. "Yes," he said. "Ned says it's just the quiet, that's why it feels like something." She paused. "I think Ned's wrong. Your brother seems like a careful man," Aemon said. "Careful men like careful explanations." "He's wonderful," she said, "and deeply exasperating." She said it with the complete comfort of someone who has never had to choose between those two things about a sibling. "Are you careful?" He thought about it honestly. "I plan carefully," he said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing. What's the difference?" "Careful men avoid risks. I just make sure I understand them before I take them." He looked at the heart tree. "There's a difference between caution and preparation." She was quiet for a moment. "Father says you're the most unusual prince he's ever heard of," she said. "He didn't mean it as an insult." "How did he mean it?" "Like," she seemed to search for the right framing, "like you're something that was supposed to be one thing and turned into something else. Like the world expected one shape from you and you decided you had a different idea about it." She paused. "I think he respects it. It takes him a while to show things like that." "He showed it in about 4 minutes of riding yesterday, actually," Aemon said. She looked at him sharply. "What?" "The way he opened the gates himself instead of sending a steward. The way he came out to meet me instead of receiving me inside. Those are small choices, but they're choices. They say, I'm not performing for you, I'm meeting you. That's a form of respect, an unusual one." He paused. "I thought it was generous of him." Lyanna was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her reassessing something, adjusting some estimate she'd arrived with. "You notice small things," she said. "Everything important is small," he said. "The large things are just what happens when you miss the small ones." She looked at him. He looked back. The godswood was very quiet around them, the pool still, the face of the heart tree watching the water with its carved expression. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. It sounded like a conclusion she'd been working toward. "What did you expect? A southern prince?" She said it with the particular stark inflection that made southern sound like a diagnosis. "Silver hair and prophecy and harp music." He laughed. Genuinely the full thing, the way Jon Snow laughed, complete when it came. "I do have the silver hair," he said. "The rest of it. I leave the harp to my father," he said. "I'm better with a sword." She grinned again, and he thought, not for the first time and not with any ambiguity about what he was feeling, that Lyanna Stark at 13 was already the kind of person who made the world better by being in it, and that he would do absolutely anything in his power to make sure she stayed in it for a long time. The real test came the next morning. He'd known about Ned Stark in the abstract the way you know about someone who shaped a significant portion of your life, without ever meeting you directly. The abstract was a man of such thorough, unpretentious honor that the very straightforwardness of him had seemed like a kind of genius. The concrete, turning out at the eastern gate in the gray early morning with a training sword and a politely wary face, was a young man of 18 who had Jon Arryn's careful education sitting on top of Stark bones and the particular expression of someone who was going to be fair about this even if it killed him. "I thought we could spar," Aemon said. "If you're willing." Ned Stark looked at him. He had the same gray eyes as Lyanna, but where hers moved and calculated, his were steady. The eyes of someone who decided what he thought about a thing and then looked at it the same way every time, because truth didn't change based on the angle. "I'm willing," he said. They were of a similar height, similar build, though Ned had the finished solidity of a man whose body had decided on its shape, and Aemon still had the lean, unfinished quality of someone still growing. Ned had been trained properly. Jon Arryn would have seen to that, and he moved into the first exchange with the economical competence of a man who didn't try to impress, just did the work. The first exchange was clean and mutual. The second exchange was when Ned realized that the prince was considerably better than he'd looked in the first exchange. "You're holding back," Ned said in the brief pause after the third exchange. "I was calibrating," Aemon said. "I wanted to see your measure before I matched it." "That sounds polite." "It was practical," Aemon said. "Come on, properly." Ned Stark, to his significant credit, did not let the revelation that his sparring partner was operating at a different level cause him to either fold or perform. He simply adjusted, tightened, focused, brought everything he had to the problem with the same steady completeness he brought to everything. He was good, genuinely good. He lost the next 4 exchanges, but he lost them in interesting ways, and every time he got up he'd identified what had happened and was compensating for it. "You're learning in real time," Aemon said after the 4th. He wasn't breathing hard. He was trying to be honest about that fact without making it a statement of superiority. "Isn't that the point of sparring?" Ned said. He was breathing harder but not unduly. His face was composed, there was no embarrassment in it, no wounded pride, just attention. "For most people the point is to win," Aemon said. "Winning in practice is worth less than learning in practice," Ned said. He said it like it was obvious, like the mathematics of it were too clear to need defending. Aemon looked at him for a moment. He felt something in his chest that was specific and warm and had a name he didn't say out loud. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about you for a while. What you'd be like." Ned blinked. "Thinking about me." "You and Lord Baratheon both," Aemon said. He set the practice sword against the fence and picked up a water skin. "The two of you together and Lord Arryn's influence, that's not an accident of fostering, that's a deliberate formation. Arryn knew what he was building." "He was raising boys to be lords," Ned said carefully. "He was raising these boys to be these lords," Aemon said, "which is a specific thing." He offered the water skin. Ned took it, drank, handed it back. "I'd like to meet Robert Baratheon. Not officially, not at court. Somewhere real. Is he likely to come north before summer ends?" Ned was quiet for a moment. "He talks about wanting to," he said. "He misses," he paused, choosing. "He was happy here as a boy. Before the fostering." "Yes." Ned's face did something that was controlled but not quite controlled enough, some feeling about that time too large to fully contain. "He was different then." "He's not yet what he'll become," Aemon said quietly. "There's still time to affect what that is." He met Ned's gray gaze directly. "That's why I came here, Ned. Not just for the diplomatic alliance, though we need that too, and your father and I have been talking and I think it will come. I came because I've been thinking for a long time about what's going to break in this kingdom, and I think the answer depends in part on who we become to each other. You and me, us and Robert." He paused. "Does that sound mad?" Ned looked at him for a long time with those steady gray eyes that did not flinch from things they decided to look at. "It sounds like something my father would say if he were 20 years younger and said things out loud," he said. Aemon blinked, then laughed. "That's the best thing anyone said to me in months." Ned's mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "I'll write to Robert," he said. "He can be here in a fortnight if he rides fast, which he usually does." "Thank you," Aemon said, and meant it simply. The fortnight passed in the best kind of days. He sparred with Ned every morning, not practicing, genuinely working, the kind of training that hurt in useful ways. He rode with Lyanna 3 afternoons, and she was on horseback the way she was everywhere. As if the horse were an extension of herself she'd been born knowing how to use. She pushed the pace every time, looked back at him with those gray eyes to see if he'd kept up, and seemed to find it satisfying when he had. He talked with Lord Rickard in the evenings, after dinner, when the hall had emptied and Rickard's public face had put itself away for the night. The man was precisely what Aemon had expected from Ned's father, deeply intelligent, deeply laconic, with opinions formed over years of managing a hard land and unlikely to be shifted by anything but equally solid evidence. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke it tended to end conversations rather than continue them, which was the mark of a man who'd long since stopped bothering to persuade anyone and simply stated what was true. Aemon didn't try to persuade him either. He just talked to him about the realm, about the pattern of Aerys' deterioration, about the wildfire beneath the city, which he shared carefully and watched the older man receive with a stillness that told him Rhaegar had suspected something was wrong at the center without having the specific shape of it. "My father is moving toward a regency," Aemon said on the third evening. "Carefully, with the right lords building the right case. He needs the North actively with him, not watching." "What does actively with him look like?" Rhaegar asked. "A commitment before the council, your endorsement formally given to a petition for regency. It would take the crown's request seriously and signal to other lords that the North has made its assessment." He paused. "I'm not asking for armies." "Not yet," Rhaegar said. "Not at all if the regency works cleanly." Rhaegar looked at the fire for a moment. "And if it doesn't, then we have a different conversation," Aemon said. "But let's build the thing that doesn't need armies before we build the thing that does." Another pause. Rhaegar picked up his cup. "My son likes you," he said. "I like him. That's not common. People are usually uncertain of Ned." He paused. "He doesn't perform. People don't know what to do with someone who doesn't perform." "I know," Aemon said. "I'm not either." Rhaegar looked at him sideways. "No," he said slowly. "No, you're not." He drank. "I'll give you the formal support. Write me the language and I'll review it. If it says what you say it says, I'll sign it." "It will," Aemon said. "I know it will," Rhaegar said simply, which was the stark version of a ringing endorsement, and Aemon received it as such. Robert Baratheon arrived on the 13th day, 2 days before Aemon's planned departure, on a horse that was breathing hard, and with the loud, uncomplicated energy of a force of nature that had decided to have a good time. He was 18. Enormous in the way that Targaryens were occasionally tall and Starks were occasionally broad. Robert was both, somehow. A black-haired giant with a laugh you could hear from the other side of a courtyard, and the physical ease of someone who had never once in his life questioned whether his body was adequate to the situation. He embraced Ned in the yard with the force of a small avalanche. He kissed Lyanna on the cheek. She elbowed him in the ribs. He laughed so hard he nearly fell down. He turned and saw Aemon. Aemon saw the calculation happen fast, a flicker, the social reading of a young man who was more perceptive than his presentation suggested. Robert had grown up in a lord's household watching his father manage relationships, and under all the noise and physicality there was something sharp and assessing that he wore loosely, the way he wore his clothes. "The Dragon Prince," Robert said. His voice was warm and big like the rest of him. "I've been hearing about you for months. Ned's letters have been extremely informative." "Good things, I hope," Aemon said. "He said you train like you're trying to injure yourself and that you ask stranger questions than anyone he's met." Robert grinned. "So yes, good things." He extended a hand and Aemon shook it, and Robert's grip was enormous and he did not moderate it, and Aemon matched it without comment, and Robert seemed to find this satisfying. "I've wanted to meet you," Aemon said. "Here I am," Robert said expansively, gesturing at himself as if presenting a landmark. "Here you are." Aemon looked at him, this large, laughing, vital young man who in another life would be a king eating himself from the inside, who would be a great man undone by one specific grief. "I'd like to spar with you tomorrow morning if you're not too tired from the ride." Robert's grin widened. "I'm never too tired to spar." He glanced at Ned. "Is he as good as you've been pretending he isn't?" Ned's face performed what was for him a significant expression of innocence. "I described your skills accurately, Robert." "You described yourself getting beaten repeatedly and then said he was better than that," Robert said, "which I took to mean he was extremely good." He looked at Aemon. "Are you extremely good?" "I'm good," Aemon said. "You might be better. I genuinely don't know yet." Something lit up in Robert's face at that. The honest answer, unexpected, and Aemon understood in that moment exactly what Robert Baratheon needed from the world. Not deference, not management, but honesty. Honesty and a worthy opponent. He'd been given too much deference and not enough challenge, and the combination had made him larger in some directions and smaller in others than he should have been. "Tomorrow morning," Robert said, "I'll try not to hurt you." "You won't," Aemon said pleasantly. Robert laughed the enormous laugh. Lyanna rolled her eyes at both of them with the expression of someone who has known one of them her entire life, and is unsurprised to find the other is identical in the ways that matter. The morning came gray and cold, the yard damp with a frost that hadn't fully committed to being ice. Robert in the yard without an audience was different from Robert with one, more focused, stripped of the performance, the physicality still enormous but directed now rather than general. He was very good. The first exchange told Aemon everything he needed to know and almost the floor of the yard. Robert was faster than his size suggested, not delicate, not technical, but powered with such overwhelming force and momentum that the conventional calculus about reach and leverage needed recalibrating from first principles. He hit like a wall that was moving toward you. Aemon adapted. Not in the clean, gradual way of the Ned sparring. There was no gradual with Robert. He had to adapt immediately, or he was going to be on his back in the frost, and he reached for everything. Darry's classical form, Oberyn's dirty geometry, the 4 years of self-developed technique that lived in his joints rather than his head, and threw it all at the problem of Robert Baratheon simultaneously. He went to the ground twice in the first 6 exchanges. He got up both times, and the second time Robert paused and looked at him with something new in his face, a focused, stripped-down respect that was different from the cheerful social respect of the night before. "You're not trying to fight me the same way twice," Robert said. "You'd win if I did," Aemon said. He rolled his neck. "You're stronger than anyone I've sparred with." But you commit," Aemon said. "You go all the way into every swing. It's overwhelming, but it leaves the line open briefly afterward." He paused. "Ned said you're decisive. This is what he meant." Robert looked at him for a moment. "You're talking while we're fighting." "I'm talking about the fighting while we're in a pause," Aemon said. "There's a difference." A beat. Robert laughed, shorter than his usual laugh, more genuine. "Again," he said. They went for another 40 minutes and neither of them won cleanly. Aemon landed more touches. Robert put him on the ground one more time, a raw power move that no amount of technique was going to stop without more mass behind the defense than Aemon currently had. They finished breathing hard, both of them, the frost burned off the yard around them by the work of it. Ned was sitting on the fence. Lyanna was beside him. Neither of them had left, and both of them had the expression of people who had watched something worth watching. "You're a real fighter," Robert said. He wasn't breathless, just worked. "Not a prince who trains, an actual fighter." "So are you," Aemon said. "You just don't use all of it yet." Robert tilted his head. "What does that mean?" "Means you rely on the Force because the Force has always been enough. But there's a version of you that uses the Force and the technique both, and that version is very nearly unbeatable." He looked at Robert steadily. "You could get there. You're not there yet." It was the kind of thing that most people would resent. Robert Baratheon looked at him for a beat, and Aemon held it, didn't flinch back from it, didn't soften it, and Robert nodded once in the same way Rickard Stark had nodded 3 nights ago. "Will you spar with me tomorrow too?" Robert asked. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Aemon said, "but I'll be back and I'll write. And you should write too, to me, not just to Ned." He paused. "I want to know how you're doing, genuinely." Robert looked at him with those big blue eyes that were younger than the rest of him and older than they looked. "You're building something," he said. It was almost exactly what Tywin had said, but where Tywin's version had been assessment, Robert's was a question dressed as a statement, hoping for a real answer. "Yes," Aemon said. He looked at Robert, then at Ned on the fence, then at Lyanna beside him. He looked at the three of them together, the Stormlands and the North and everything they represented. Here in a frost-burned training yard in the most ancient kingdom on the continent. And he felt the weight of what this moment was and what it could become. Something worth building, he said. He found Lyanna alone in the hour before he left, in the godswood where she spent more time than she probably admitted to, sitting beside the still pool and throwing small stones at the far side with the focused aimlessness of someone whose mind was elsewhere. She didn't look up when he arrived. She threw another stone. "You're leaving," she said. "In an hour," he agreed. He sat down on the bank nearby because this felt like a conversation that should happen at the same level. She was quiet for a moment. "Robert likes you," she said. "That's not nothing. He doesn't usually like people quietly. He either loves them or ignores them. You're different." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." She glanced at him sidelong. "What are you actually doing, not the diplomatic version, the real one?" He considered her. She was 13, and she had those stark eyes that looked at things until they told the truth, and she had the particular fearlessness of someone who had decided a long time ago that she'd rather know the honest shape of something than a comfortable lie about it. "I'm trying to make sure something terrible doesn't happen," he said. "Something that would hurt a lot of people, including," he paused, "including people in this godswood." She stilled. The stone she'd been about to throw stayed in her hand. "What kind of something?" "The kind that starts small and grows until it burns everything," he said quietly. "Wars always look like politics first. Then they look like mistakes. Then they look like inevitability, and by then they're already burning." She looked at him now fully, those gray eyes direct and unashamed of their directness. "Does it involve my family?" He held her gaze. "It involves everyone," he said carefully, "which is why it matters who knows about it early enough to change the shape of it." She was quiet for a long moment. The pool was still. The heart tree watched. "You're not just a prince," she said finally. Not accusatory, not awed, just naming it. "I'm exactly a prince," he said. "I just know what that means." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she threw the stone. It skipped across the pool 3-4 times and vanished. "Write to me," she said. "Not official letters, real ones. Tell me what's actually happening." Something in his chest shifted with a warmth that was complicated and old and had no clean category. "I will," he said. "You might find them alarming." "Good," she said. "Comfortable letters are boring." He stood, brushed off his boots, looked at the heart tree one more time. "Take care of yourself," he said, and meant it with everything he had. "Take care of yourself," she said back with the frank practicality of someone who took the instructions seriously. Then, after a beat, "And bring the dragon next time. I want to see her." "She'll head-butt you," Aemon warned. "Then we'll get on fine," Lyanna said, and threw another stone, and he left the godswood with the sound of it skipping behind him. He rode south with 30 men and a great deal more than he'd arrived with. The formal alliance with Lord Rhaegar, drafted and signed. Ned's measured friendship, which was as real and as durable as the stone he'd been built from. Robert's rougher, louder version of the same thing. Lyanna's instruction to write real letters. And something else. Something that he turned over carefully in his mind as Winterfell shrank behind him, and the Wolfswood opened up ahead. A sense of the shape of things, of the human geography of what was coming and what could be changed in it. The North would hold. Ned would be what he'd always been, the steadiest thing in a shifting world. Robert was the variable, the one who could go several directions still, and the direction he went depended enormously on what he felt about the people around him. That was workable. That was something he could tend. He thought about the tourney at Harrenhal, now a little over a year away. He thought about Rhaegar and the wildfire and the small council and Tywin Lannister, somewhere in Casterly Rock, making his careful calculations. He thought about Varys in his underground room, mapping fire beneath a city. He thought about all the pieces on the board and how they sat now versus how they'd sat 2 years ago, and he felt, carefully, without letting himself fully believe it, the very first edges of something that might be called hope. The wolfswood surrounded him. The cold came through his riding clothes in the way of the north, not aggressively, just persistently, reminding you that it was always there, that the cold was the truth of this place and warmth was the visitor. He didn't mind it. He rode forward into it, south toward fires that hadn't been lit yet, toward a throne he didn't want and a kingdom he intended to save anyway, and the trees closed behind him like a door and the north let him go. Chapter 5. The Mad Kings fire the ravens came in the wrong order. That was the first sign. Not the content of them, the content was bad enough, but content could be managed. It was the sequence. Aerys had summoned Rhaegar first, then the small council, then the lords of the crownlands, all in separate ravens sent hours apart, which meant whoever had drafted them had been interrupted between drafts or had changed the plan mid-execution. Aerys never changed plans mid-execution. He was many things, and one of those things had always been a certain terrible consistency of purpose, once he'd decided on a course. The inconsistency meant he was frightened. Frightened kings with wildfire caches were the specific thing Aemon had been preparing against for 12 years. He read the 3 ravens in sequence, standing in the map room at Dragonstone in the gray morning light with the candles still burning from the night before, and he felt everything he'd built over the years click into alignment the way a mechanism clicks when the key turns, not comfortably, not with satisfaction, but with the cold precision of a thing that was designed for exactly this moment and had been waiting for it. When did these arrive? He asked. The Maester, old Gerardes, who had served Dragonstone for 30 years and had long since stopped being surprised by anything the prince did, checked his notes. The first at midnight, the second at the second hour, the third just before dawn, 3 separate ravens. Yes, my prince. Aemon set them down on the table in order. He looked at them without touching them. Then he said, "Send for my father, tell him it's urgent, and send word to Sir Darry that I want the garrison ready to move within 4 hours." Gerardes left without asking questions. That was the other thing about long service. You stopped asking questions and started trusting the person who had the full picture. Rhaegar came in 10 minutes later, still pulling on his doublet, with the quick controlled movement of a man who'd been awake before the summons arrived and had been waiting for something. He read the ravens. His face, already careful, went very careful. "He's moving against the lords of the crownlands," he said quietly. 3 of them, Aemon said. Lord Darkland, Lord Hollard, and Lord Ricker. The charges are treason, which means someone whispered the word to him and he believed it. Whether there's any substance to it is irrelevant at this point. He stopped. Picked up the second raven, the one to the small council. "This one is the problem. He's asking Chelsted to authorize the use of the guild." Rhaegar went still. "The alchemists. He wants wildfire used on Duskendale." Aemon laid the raven back down, not as a threat, as a sentence. The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. Rhaegar set both hands flat on the table and looked at the ravens with the expression of a man watching a fire spread toward something he loves and calculating whether he can outrun it. "Chelsted won't authorize it," Rhaegar said. "He's many things, but he wouldn't. He doesn't need to authorize it," Aemon said. "He just needs to not stop it. And right now Chelsted is less afraid of refusing grandfather than he is of being seen to refuse him. The distinction matters." He looked at his father. "If wildfire burns Duskendale, there's no regency. There's no council petition. There's a war immediately, with every lord in Westeros taking sides based on which side scares them less. That's not a position we can win from." Rhaegar looked at him. "What do you propose?" Aemon had been building this plan for 2 years. He'd revised it 4 times, stress-tested the weak points with Varys through a cipher correspondence that had become one of the more intellectually satisfying exchanges of his life, and gone over the final version with Elia 3 weeks ago, when he'd first noticed the pattern of Aerys's behavior shifting in the particular direction that meant something was building. He laid it out, not quickly, precisely. Each piece in order, the logic connecting them, the contingencies named and addressed. Rhaegar listened without interrupting, which was one of his great qualities. He gave information the room it needed. Twice he raised a hand slightly, which was his gesture for "I have a question but it can wait," and both times Aemon got to the answer before the question needed asking. When he finished, Rhaegar was quiet for a long moment. "You've been preparing this for 2 years," he said. "Yes. Varys is involved. He's been mapping the caches. He has 37 locations now with estimated quantities. He also has names of the guild members who transport rather than manufacture, the ones whose loyalty to the guild is financial rather than ideological." Aemon paused. "They can be redirected." "Redirected," Rhaegar repeated. "A pyromancer who makes wildfire is a craftsman with professional loyalty. A porter who moves it is a man who needs to feed his family. Those are different problems with different solutions." He met his father's eyes. "I'm not asking anyone to commit treason. I'm asking them to have a lapse of efficiency, delays, mislaid routes, standard logistical difficulty." Rhaegar looked at him for a long moment with that expression that had become familiar over the years, the one that lived in the territory between pride and grief. Then he straightened. "When do we leave?" "Now," Aemon said. "If we leave now and ride hard, we arrive in King's Landing before the alchemists receive the formal order. Once the formal order arrives, we're stopping something in motion. If we arrive before it, we're preventing something from starting. Those are very different positions." "What about your mother?" "She knows," Aemon said. "I spoke to her before I sent for you." His father's eyes closed briefly, opened. "Of course you did," he said quietly, and there was something in it that wasn't accusation, something more like a man recognizing the full extent of what he'd been given and not quite knowing how to hold it. "Father," Aemon said, "she's better at this than either of us. She's been managing the shape of the court for 17 years without anyone knowing she was managing it. The only reason we're still standing on clean ground is partly her work." He paused. "Use her properly. Don't protect her from the situation. She can see the situation better than most." Rhaegar looked at him. "When did you become the one telling me about my wife?" he said, and the smallest possible smile was underneath it, tired and real. "When it needed saying," Aemon said. "Are we leaving?" "We're leaving," Rhaegar said. Seasmoke's shadow covered the Kingsroad in the early afternoon sun, and the column of riders beneath her moved at the kind of pace that told every village they passed that something was happening, and that something was moving fast. Rhaegar rode at the front. Aemon was in the air. He'd had this argument with his father 2 hours out of Dragonstone. Ride with the column, it's safer. And he'd won it with a single practical point. Seasmoke could cover the distance in 1/3 of the time and arrive ahead of the column to assess the situation before Rhaegar rode into it. His father had looked at the logic and been unable to find the flaw in it, and had let him go with the particular expression of a man who keeps losing arguments to his 17-year-old son and has stopped expecting to win. From the air, King's Landing looked like a city that was pretending nothing was wrong. That was its own kind of wrong. Aemon brought Seasmoke down on the broad flat of the tourney grounds outside the city walls. She was large enough now that landing in the city itself required more space than the streets provided without incident. And an incident was the specific thing he was trying to avoid. He landed, stripped off the riding harness, pressed his forehead briefly to Seasmoke's neck in the gesture that meant stay. "I'll be back." And she folded herself down with the put-upon dignity of a creature humoring someone she'd chosen to tolerate. The city gates opened for a Targaryen prince without ceremony or delay. Inside, he rode fast through streets that moved out of his way, and he was at the Red Keep in 20 minutes. Varys was waiting for him inside the eastern entrance. Not visibly waiting, just present, as if he'd happened to be in that corridor at that moment, which could have been coincidence if Aemon hadn't known better for the last 5 years. Formal order went to the guild 2 hours ago, Varys said without preamble, falling into step beside him. Aemon felt his jaw tight. How far along? The guild master received it. He hasn't acted on it yet. These things require preparation, and he's a cautious man who prefers to confirm orders of this nature before proceeding. A fractional pause. You have perhaps 4 hours before the confirmation is sought and the preparation begins. After that, the timeline compresses. Where is he? The throne room, Varys said. He's been there since this morning. The small council is with him. Another pause. Lord Chelsted is unhappy. Chelsted is always unhappy. He's unhappy in a specific direction today, Varys said. He argued against the order. Aemon stopped walking. He turned to look at Varys. He argued against it, vigorously. The king was not receptive. Varys met his eyes. Chelsted is a political man who has spent his career navigating between positions without ever fully committing to one. Today he committed. Whatever the consequences of that are, they'll be significant. Aemon thought about Chelsted, the man he'd maneuvered around at 14, the man who'd tried to surveil his mother's correspondence, the small, careful schemer who had never, in his assessment, been fundamentally cruel. Just opportunistic, just afraid, and today afraid had pointed him in a different direction for once. Where is he now? Outside the throne room, Varys said. Waiting. Good, Aemon said. I need him to wait a little longer. He started walking again. The 3 lords, Darklyn, Hollard, Ricker, where are they being held? The black cells, Varys said. Since yesterday evening. Are the charges real? No more real than most charges that come from whispers the king finds convenient, Varys said, which was his precise and careful way of saying number. Have them moved to the tower cells. Aemon said. Not released, moved. Better conditions. More guards, reliable ones, with instructions that no one goes in without my direct authorization. That will require the king's authority, yes, Aemon said. I'll have it within the hour. He glanced at Varys sidelong. Be ready to move quickly once I'm out of that room. The window between what I'm about to do and the situation becoming unmanageable is shorter than I'd like. Varys looked at him with those pale, sharp eyes that had been watching him for 14 years and had still not entirely settled on what they were seeing. Your Highness, he said, and it had the quality of a question rather than a title. I know, Aemon said. Trust me anyway. A pause, brief and weighty. I'll be ready, Varys said. The throne room was full. Not the full of a feast or a ceremony, the full of a situation which was different, which had the particular charged density of too many people in a room where something dangerous was happening, and no one is sure whether moving will make it worse. The small council was ranged to one side. 3 lords of the Crownlands in traveling clothes near the doors, 20 or 30 courtiers positioned at the precise distances their various calculations had determined were safest. Aerys was in the throne. He was not having a good day. Aemon had last seen him 6 months ago in one of the lucid periods, and in those 6 months something had accelerated. The long hair and tangled beard were the same, but the eyes were worse. Not clouded, nothing as merciful as clouded. They were very clear and very busy, tracking movements, reading intentions, finding the malice that lived in perfectly innocent gestures, the conspiracy in an unguarded glance. He sat in the throne with his hands gripping the armrests, and his nails had grown again, curved and yellowed, and he looked like a man who had been running for a long time inside his own head, and had convinced himself that something real was chasing him. Aemon walked in without announcing himself. He'd considered this entrance, how to make it, what it communicated before he said a word. He came in at a steady pace, not hurried, not performing calm, just walking with the complete ease of someone arriving at a place they belong and doing it as naturally as breathing. Silver hair, Dornish blade on his hip, the Targaryen features that were their own announcement in any room. He walked the length of the throne room toward the dais, and he did not look at the small council or the courtiers or the crownlands lords. He looked at Aerys. Aerys saw him. Something moved in those busy, fractured eyes, recognition, then calculation, then something that might have been genuine relief before the suspicion reassembled itself over the top of it. "Grandson," Aerys said. "Grandfather," Aemon said. He stopped at the foot of the dais. "I came as quickly as I could. I heard you were troubled." A slight stiffening through the room. Troubled was the wrong word for a king. In the official register, it was a word you used for children, for servants, for people who needed managing. He'd chosen it deliberately for exactly that reason, in exactly the same way he'd chosen to count the swords of the throne when he was 5. Not flattery, not deference, but acknowledgement. "I see you. I see what this is. I'm here." Troubled, Aerys repeated. His voice was tight like a bowstring pulled past its rating. "They're plotting against me, Darklyn and his ilk, sitting in my own crownlands, conspiring." "What evidence?" Aemon asked. Silence. The particular silence of a room in which a question has been asked that everyone wanted to ask and no one had. "I beg your pardon," Aerys said. "I'm asking what evidence you have," Aemon said. He kept his voice steady and curious, not challenging, the voice of a man who needs information in order to help, not the voice of a man who suspects the answer. "If the charges are treasonous conspiracy, there will be evidence, correspondence, witnesses. I'd like to review it so that when Father arrives and asks me to brief him on the situation, I can do it accurately." Aerys stared at him. "Your father is coming." "He's a day behind me," Aemon said. "I flew." He met his grandfather's eyes without flinching, without performing confidence, just with the settled, absolute certainty of a young man who knows exactly where he stands. "He wants to support you in managing this. We both do. That's why I came ahead, to make sure the situation was fully understood before he arrived." Aerys's grip on the armrest shifted. His eyes moved around the room, to the council, to the lords, to Aemon, with the restless movement of a mind checking its perimeter. "The evidence," Aerys said, and the word came out differently from how it had entered the room, smaller, less certain, like a man testing the ground he'd been standing on. "Yes," Aemon said. "Who brought the charges to your attention?" "A reliable source, I'm sure. I'd just like to review the chain of it." He paused, then added, "For the record, these things should be on record." From the corner of his eye he could see Lord Chelstead near the council, and Chelstead's face was doing something complicated, recognition and relief, and the complicated expression of a man watching someone else do what he'd failed to do. The king was quiet for a long, unsteady moment. The room was perfectly still. "Rossart," Aerys said finally, "the pyromancer." "Rossart brought me. With what documentation?" Aemon asked. Another silence, shorter this time. Aerys looked at his hands. The curved nails against the armrests. Something in his face was moving, not sanity returning. It was too late for that, but something adjacent to it. Some older layer of himself that still understood the vocabulary of evidence and process, and the difference between accusation and proof. He said, "I'd like to speak with Rossart," Aemon said, "and I'd like the lords released to better quarters while the evidence is formally reviewed. Not freed, not yet, but moved." He held his grandfather's fractured gaze. "That's the proper procedure. You know that. You know how it's supposed to work." He was reaching for the man Aerys had been. Not naively, he knew that man was mostly gone, but the ghost of him was still in there somewhere. The king who'd had 20 good years, who'd known the law and respected the forms of it, and sometimes you could reach the ghost when you couldn't reach the person. Ares was very still. Then, slowly, something settled. Not resolution, not peace, more like a fire banking slightly, still hot, still dangerous, but lower. "Review the evidence," Ares said. His voice was different, older, more tired, like a different man briefly speaking through the same mouth. "Rossart will present it." "Thank you," Aemon said. He turned to the council. "Lord Chelstead, would you coordinate the transfer of the detained lords to the tower cells? Better conditions, additional guards, my authorization pending the king's confirmation." Chelstead looked at him with the expression of a man who had been drowning and has just been handed something solid. "Of course, Your Highness," he said. Aemon turned back to the throne. "I'll need an hour with the records room, grandfather, to prepare properly for father's arrival." Ares waved a hand. Dismissal or assent or both. He was looking at the far wall now, somewhere else again, the brief window closing. Aemon bowed correctly, completely, no irony in it, and turned and left the throne room. In the corridor he walked fast. He had the hour he'd bought and not a minute more. Varys materialized from a doorway. "The lords are being moved," he said. "Good, the pyromancer Rossart, where is he?" "In the guild hall near the Street of Steel." "I need someone to delay his arrival here for as long as possible, not stop him, delay traffic, a lame horse, a door that sticks, whatever is available." He kept moving. "What's the fastest route to the guild hall from here?" Varys blinked. "You're going yourself." "Someone needs to have a conversation with the guild master before the king's confirmation arrives," Aemon said. "That conversation needs to carry weight. I'm the weight." He glanced at Varys. "The delay on Rossart." "I have someone," Varys said. He was moving alongside Aemon now, keeping pace. "Your Highness, the guild master is not a man who responds to. He responds to reality," Aemon said. "And the reality is that a regency is coming. My father will be king in function within the year. And any guild that has been burning living people on the basis of whispered accusations from a deteriorating king is a guild whose future should cause it considerable concern." He paused at a junction, took the right-hand corridor toward the eastern exit. "I'm offering him a way out, not a threat, a way out. Guilds like having ways out." Varys was quiet for a moment. "The guild master's name is Belis," he said. "He's greedy, not ideological. He took the commission because the money was significant." "Then the conversation will be about money," Aemon said. "More of it for services that don't involve burning cities." He pushed through the side door into the afternoon light. "Send word to Chelstead. He should be in the records room in 30 minutes. I need the charges formally entered as pending review, which means nothing can be executed on them until the review is concluded. That review needs to begin officially today." "And last?" Varys asked. "As long as it needs to," Aemon said. He swung up onto the horse one of Varys' men had waiting in the courtyard. Because Varys' men always had things waiting. It was one of the things that made him invaluable. And rode out into King's Landing at a pace that made people get out of the way. The summer sun hot on his silver hair, and the city's complicated smell rising around him. The guildmaster was a small man with the wide, calculating eyes of someone who had spent a career accurately reading which way things were falling. He received Aemon in a room above the guild hall that smelled of sulfur and old smoke, with the careful courtesy of a man who was extremely uncertain what this visit meant, and was keeping all options available. Aemon sat down across from him without being invited to. He set the Dornish blade on the table between them, not as a threat, just setting it down, the way you set down a bag you've been carrying, and looked at Belis with the focused, uncomplicated attention that he'd learned from Varys and refined from years of practice. "You received a formal order this morning," he said. Belis was very still. "Any communications between the guild and—" "The confirmation hasn't arrived yet," Aemon said. "I know that because I'm the reason it hasn't arrived yet. You have perhaps 2 hours before it does." He looked at the man steadily. I want to discuss what happens in those 2 hours. Belize looked at the blade on the table, looked at Aemon, looked at the blade. The guild operates under royal charter, he said carefully. Yes, Aemon said, and royal charters can be reviewed, amended, or revoked by the crown when the crown's interests require it. He paused. I'm not here to revoke your charter, Master Belize. I'm here to offer you something more durable than a royal commission from a king whose sanity is a matter of considerable public discussion. Belize's careful face twitched. A tell, the word sanity landing the way it was meant to, opening a door. The Prince Rhaegar is coming, Aemon said. He arrives tomorrow. Within a year, probably sooner, he will be the effective ruler of this kingdom. I am his son and heir. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. The guild's future depends on who holds authority going forward, not who holds it today. Executing an order that will be universally characterized as the murder of innocent lords on the basis of a madman's paranoia is not the foundation you want going forward. The word madman in the air between them was a line crossed, and they both knew it, and Belize sat with the fact of it for a moment. What are you asking for? Belize asked quietly. A delay on the order, Aemon said, documented as logistical difficulty. Sufficient quantities of the product cannot be prepared in the required time frame. Standard professional limitation. The order is not refused, it's pending. He paused. It will become moot before the pending period ends. And in exchange, the guild's charter is renewed under the Regency with an expanded commission for defensive fortification work. Legitimate work. Well paid. He held the man's gaze. And nobody asks hard questions about recent history. Belize was quiet for a long moment. He was doing the mathematics of it. Aemon could see the calculation happening, could see the man weighing the present danger against the future advantage, could see the specific moment when the scales tipped. Logistical difficulty, Belize said carefully. The most regrettable kind, Aemon agreed. Another silence. Then Belize inclined his head in a motion so slight it was barely movement at all. The guild regrets it cannot fulfill the commission in the requested time frame, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man reading from a document he's already decided to write. Aemon picked up the Dornish blade and stood. I'll have the charter terms to you within the week, he said, after my father arrives. He left the guild hall and rode back to the Red Keep, and the afternoon was tilting toward evening, and the city around him was still doing its impersonation of a city where nothing was wrong, and he let it, because the performance wasn't hurting anyone and it would be true soon enough. Rhaegar arrived the next morning. He rode through the Gate of the Gods with 50 men, and the composed bearing of a man who had been told the immediate crisis was managed and was processing his relief through carefully maintained dignity. He found Aemon waiting for him in the outer courtyard, and the first thing he said before dismounting, before greeting anyone, was, "The lords, in the tower, charges formally pending review. Nothing can move on them without the review concluding." Aemon looked up at his father. "Rossart arrived 3 hours after I left and found the confirmation delayed and the formal review already begun. He went back to the guild hall. He hasn't returned." Rhaegar dismounted. He looked at his son with that look, the one that had evolved over 17 years from bewildered wonder to something much more complex and much more fundamental. "Tell me everything," he said. Aemon told him. All of it, the guild master, the charter, Chelsted, and the formal review, Varys' role in the delay, the specific pressure points he'd used and why. He told it clean and fast, no editorializing, just the sequence of events and the logic connecting them. When he finished, Rhaegar stood in the courtyard with the early sun on his silver hair and was quiet for a long moment. "You arrived here alone," he said. "Without me. You walked into that throne room and redirected the king without counsel, without backup, without—" "There wasn't time," Aemon said. I know there wasn't time, Rhaegar said, and his voice was careful in a way that meant it was doing significant work to stay that way. I know exactly why you did it the way you did it, and I know it worked, and I am telling you, Aemon, that He stopped, tried again. You are 17 years old. I know how old I am, Aemon said. You keep saying that, his father said, and something in his voice broke slightly, just at the edge, and what broke through was not anger but fear, the specific fear of a father who loves what his son has become and is terrified of what it costs him. You always say that like it's an answer. I'm not asking about your age. I'm asking about you. He looked at his son directly with nothing held back in it. Are you all right? The question landed the way it had landed the last time his father asked it, outside the keep 2 years ago, and it did the same thing to him. Broke through the professional surface to the person underneath, the one who was tired and old in ways that had no convenient expression. Yes, Aemon said, then more honestly, mostly. Mostly, Rhaegar repeated. The situation is mostly controlled, Aemon said. The lords will be released when the review concludes, which I'll see to this week. The guild is redirected. The immediate crisis is over. He paused. But grandfather is getting worse faster than I'd accounted for in the planning. The window for a clean regency is closing. Rhaegar nodded slowly. He knew this. He'd known it for months. After this week, he said, after the lords are freed and the situation is clean, we move. Yes, Aemon said. It needs to be clean, Rhaegar said. It needs to be done in a way that, he stopped, started differently. He's my father. Aemon looked at him. The man who had, in another life, been only a ghost and a wound. The man who was, in this life, something much more complicated and much more present. He thought about what it meant to choose between family and necessity, between love and function, between the man your father was and the man he'd become. I know, he said quietly. I know what it is, and I know you have to do it anyway. Rhaegar looked at his son for a long moment. Then he put his hand on Aemon's shoulder, the familiar weight of it, and said nothing, because some things didn't need saying, because the son had already said them. The confrontation came 3 days later. Not planned, or rather, planned in broad strokes, and then arrived at through Aerys' own timing, because Aerys had spent the intervening days in an accelerating spiral of suspicion, and by the 4th day, he'd arrived at the conclusion that his son had come to King's Landing to take his throne. He was not wrong, technically. He just arrived at the right answer through the wrong reasoning. He called Rhaegar to the throne room alone. Rhaegar went. He didn't take Aemon with him, which was the decision Aemon had expected him to make and had not argued with, because some things between a father and son were private even when they were political, even when they were the end of an era, even when they were the hardest thing either man would do. Aemon waited in the map room with Sir Barristan Selmy, who had been quietly present throughout the past 4 days in the way that Barristan was always quietly present, the most honorable man in any room, usually standing near the door with his hand not quite on his sword, and his face carrying the careful sorrow of a man who sees clearly and cannot always act on what he sees. Barristan looked at Aemon. He'd been looking at him all week with an expression that had been developing for years, a long assessment, the kind that a knight makes about the person he might one day serve, measuring them against a standard that was partly professional and partly something much older and much more personal. You did well this week, Barristan said. He said it simply, without performance. Thank you, Sir Barristan. I've watched a great many people try to manage the king, Barristan said. Most of them got the balance wrong, either too hard or too soft. He paused. You didn't. Aemon looked at the old knight, this man who had defined honor in the face of dishonor, who had served faithfully through decades of deterioration, because his oath was the realest thing in his life and he'd never found a way to separate it from the king he'd sworn it to. It gets easier with practice, Aemon said. It shouldn't have to, Barristan said quietly. Not for you, you're 17. Aemon looked at him. You're going to tell me what my father told me, he said. Probably, Barristan said. Because it's true, he paused. And because I think, he stopped. Started again with the care of a man selecting tools for delicate work. I think that you know more than is comfortable to know, and you've been carrying it a long time, and I want you to know that what you carry is seen, even if it can't be shared. Aemon held the old knight's gaze. Something in his chest shifted in a way that was not comfortable and was not unwelcome. Thank you, he said, and meant it differently than he'd meant it the first time. They waited together in the map room while the torches burned down and the castle held its breath. When Rhaegar came back, 2 hours later, his face was the face of a man who had done something necessary and had not been destroyed by it, which was the best you could hope for from necessary things. He agreed, Rhaegar said, to a council of lords, to a formal review of his capacity. He paused. He didn't want to, he argued, he raged, and then he stopped, looked at his hands. Something went quiet in him, and he agreed. He's tired, Aemon said quietly. He's been running for a long time. Rhaegar looked at his son. He asked about you, he said. At the end, he asked if you were well. Aemon said nothing. I told him yes, Rhaegar said. Barristan put a hand on Rhaegar's arm briefly, then stepped back. Outside the window, King's Landing had settled into its night sounds, the river, the distant harbor, the dogs, the perpetual low murmur of a city that never fully slept. Aemon listened to it and thought about what came next. The Lord's Council, the formal petition, the long work of transition, and beyond that Harrenhal, which no longer needed to be the disaster it had been, which was now just a tourney, just a gathering, and he could change what it meant. He thought about Lyanna's letters, which had become one of the highlights of his months, sharp and funny, and genuinely outraged about things worth being outraged about, and underneath the humor, deeply thoughtful in the way that people are when they've had to develop their thinking without much support for it. He thought about Ned in the Vale, and Robert at Storm's End, and Tywin in Casterly Rock, all of them in the positions they needed to be in for the thing he was building to hold. He thought about the wildfire beneath the city, still there, still mapped, still sitting in its caches beneath the streets where people went about their lives without knowing. That was a problem for a different day, but it was a problem and he hadn't forgotten it. We should sleep, he said. Rhaegar blinked, then a quiet sound that was adjacent to a laugh. We should, he said. Tomorrow we start on the council list, Aemon said. I have thoughts on the order in which to approach the lords. Of course you do, his father said, and this time the laugh was more complete, and Barristan smiled at the wall, and the candles burned down another inch, and the night held them all in its quiet dark. Before he slept, Aemon went to the window of his chambers and looked out over the city. 12 years of building toward this. 12 years of Jon Snow's memories and Aemon Targaryen's life. The two of them braided into something that had no name in any language because no language had expected it to need one. He thought about the wall sometimes still, not with grief, not anymore, but with the particular awareness of a man who knows exactly how much worse everything can get, and uses that knowledge as a compass. The city breathed below him. 200,000 people in their beds, their fires, their lives, none of them knowing that a 17-year-old prince had spent the last 4 days preventing the beginning of a war that would have consumed them all. He didn't need them to know. He needed them to be alive. He needed them to be warm. He needed the children in those streets to grow up in a kingdom that functioned, and the lords in their castles to make choices based on something other than fear, and the people who mattered to him most in the world to be standing at the end of it rather than listed in someone's grief. That was the job. Not the throne. The throne was just the mechanism. The job was the thing the throne was supposed to do, and so rarely did. He was 17 years old, and he had spent those years building toward a future that was now, for the first time, actually visible. Not inevitable. Nothing was inevitable. He'd learned that from a life that had proven the opposite. But possible was enough. He looked at the stars above King's Landing, the same stars that looked down on Winterfell, on Storm's End, on Casterly Rock, on Dragonstone's black volcanic shores, and let himself feel for just a moment the full weight of how far he'd come. Then he let it go because the weight was the past and the past was done and tomorrow was the next thing. He went to bed. He slept. Chapter 6. Dragons Dawn. The Lords came to King's Landing in the dying days of summer. Not all of them, 14 in the end, which was enough. The ones who mattered most had been coming for years, in the slow, patient way of lords who have been carefully approached by the right people in the right sequence, and have had sufficient time to decide that the thing being asked of them was not only necessary but overdue. Lord Rickard Stark had ridden south with 30 men, and his characteristic economy of movement, and had arrived at the Red Keep 3 days early, which was the northern way of saying he considered this important. Lord Jon Arryn had come from the Vale with Ned at his side, 19 now, and carrying himself with the steady authority of a man who had always known what kind of lord he intended to be and had been practicing. Robert Baratheon was technically there as Arryn's ward still, technically not yet Lord of Storm's End, technically present as a guest rather than a principal, and had proceeded to make himself the loudest presence in every room he entered, which nobody seemed to mind because he was also the most genuinely warm. Tywin Lannister came last, 3 days into the gathering, with a retinue of 100 that was precisely sized to communicate power without communicating aggression, a distinction that Tywin navigated with the precision of a man who had spent 50 years turning every variable of presentation into a calculated statement. Aemon was in the outer courtyard when the Lannister column arrived. He'd been there for other reasons, going over the guard rotation with Sir Barristan, a discussion about the Eastern Gate security during the gathering that had expanded naturally into a broader conversation about the Red Keep's vulnerabilities in times of political transition, and he simply stayed when the golden banners appeared on the road. Tywin dismounted and looked across the courtyard. His eyes found Aemon immediately, the way the eyes of certain kinds of people always find the most important thing in a room first. Something moved in his face that was not quite surprise but was the memory of it, the recalibration of a man confirming that the unusual boy he'd spoken to 3 years ago had become exactly what the boy had suggested he would. "Lord Tywin," Aemon said. "Your Highness," Tywin said. He crossed the courtyard. They shook hands with the solidity of men who had an agreement between them that had been tested by time and found sound. "You look older." "I am older," Aemon said. "By 3 years." "You look older than that." He said it neutrally, observationally. "It's been a busy 3 years," Aemon said. Tywin almost smiled. The fraction of an inch movement that was, in his register, a full expression of genuine amusement. "So I've heard." He looked at the castle around them, at the gathered retinues, at the shape of the thing that had been assembled here over 2 weeks of careful work. "You built this," he said. "My father convened it." "Your father signed the letters," Tywin said. "You built it." He met Aemon's eyes with those pale green ones that assessed everything against the standard of function. "I want you to know that I came because of what you said 3 years ago, not entirely, but significantly." "I know," Aemon said. "I was counting on it." Tywin looked at him for a moment. "You were counting on me remembering a conversation with a 14-year-old for 3 years. I was counting on you being exactly who you are," Aemon said, "which is a man who makes decisions based on logic and whose logic I understood well enough to make a case that would hold." He paused. "The case holds, doesn't it?" "It holds," Tywin said simply and moved past him into the keep. The council sat for 2 days. Aemon was not in the room. He had no formal position at a Lord's Council. He was the Prince of Dragonstone, the heir, but not yet of an age or authority to sit at a table with the great lords and the King's Council. His father sat at the center of it. Barristan stood at the door. Varys was somewhere in the walls. Aemon spent the 2 days doing everything except sitting in that room. He was in the corridors, in the side chambers, in the great hall during the meals that punctuated the formal sessions. He was talking to the Lord's subordinates, the men who traveled with the great men, and were frequently more candid than their lords, because they operated under the assumption that nobody important was listening to them. He was managing the dozens of small complications that arose when 14 significant political figures and their retinues were housed in the same castle. Disputes over precedence at table. A minor altercation between Stark and Lannister household men that he diffused before it became a story. The correct sequencing of private conversations between lords who needed to align before the formal session resumed. He did all of it with the practiced invisibility of someone who had understood from childhood that the person doing the most work in a room is rarely the person sitting at the head of it. On the morning of the second day, he found Ned in the training yard. They sparred for an hour in the early light, and it was different from the first time in Winterfell. Ned was 20 now, fully formed in the way Jon Snow had always known him, with the quiet completeness of a man who had nothing to prove and no interest in performance. He fought better than he had at Winterfell, and Aemon fought considerably better than he had at Winterfell, and the hour was the kind of sparring that stops being practice and starts being something else. Two people finding out where they stand in relation to each other, not in terms of who wins, but in terms of what they are to each other when the distance is gone. "Your father's going to win the vote," Ned said in the pause after the third exchange. "Yes," Aemon said. "How are you feeling about it?" The question surprised him. Not because Ned wasn't the kind of person to ask it, he was precisely that kind of person, but because of how direct it was. Ned Stark had a particular gift for asking the thing that was directly relevant without any of the social decoration that usually surrounded sensitive questions. "Complicated," Aemon said honestly. He rolled his shoulder. "He's my grandfather. He's been burning people," Ned said, not harshly, just naming it. "I know." Aemon looked at the training sword in his hand. He wasn't always. There was a version of him that he stopped. "It doesn't matter what version there was. You're right. And I know you're right. It's just complicated to know you're right about something that also hurts." Ned was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes," in the tone of a man who knows exactly what that sentence contains because he has lived in his own version of it. They stood in the morning light and didn't say anything else for a moment, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that only existed between people who didn't need to fill it. "After this," Ned said, "what comes next?" "Transition," Aemon said. "The practical work of it, which is unglamorous and goes on for longer than anyone wants it to." He paused. "Harrenhal eventually. My father wants to hold a great tourney." Ned's face did something that was not quite reluctance. "Robert will want to compete," he said. "Of course he will." Aemon glanced at him. "You should come, both of you. Your sister too, if Lord Rickard allows it." "Lyanna will insist on it regardless of whether Lord Rickard allows it," Ned said, with the tone of a man who loves his sister fiercely and has long since stopped trying to predict what she'll do. "And he usually lets her insist." A pause. "She'll be glad to hear it. She talks about you in her letters. You and the dragon." "Seasmoke made an impression," Aemon said. "You made an impression," Ned said simply. The council concluded in the late afternoon of the second day. Rhaegar came out of the council chamber with Rickard Stark on his right and Tywin Lannister on his left, which was not an accident, which was the deliberate visual statement of a man who had spent years learning, partly from his son's insistent coaching, that the optics of power were as important as its substance. He looked tired in the way of someone who has run a very long race and has just crossed a finish line that turns out to be the start of a different race, and he looked underneath the tiredness, like a man who has done a necessary thing and found that necessary things do not come clean. Aemon fell into step beside him, one pace back as the corridor filled with lords and their men. Unanimous, Rhaegar said quietly. I expected 12, Aemon said. Tywin abstained on the formal vote and then said, in front of the assembled lords, that he found the outcome logical. Rhaegar's mouth curved slightly. Which, from Tywin Lannister, is an endorsement. He told me he came because of a conversation we had 3 years ago, Aemon said. Rhaegar glanced at him. What conversation? I'll tell you later, Aemon said. What about grandfather? The curve left his father's mouth. He'll be informed this evening. Barristan and I will go together. He paused. He'll have known it was coming. He's not even now, he's not without intelligence about these things. He'll have known since you walked into the throne room last month and stopped the Duskendale order. He knew before that, Aemon said. Yes, Rhaegar agreed. He did. They walked in silence for a moment, the castle moving around them, lords and servants and knights all doing the complicated choreography of a court in transition. After this evening, Rhaegar said, I want you at the meeting with the small council, not in the hall, in the room. Formally, you're 18 in 6 months, his father said, and you've been running half this court's actual strategy for 4 years. The pretense that you're a child waiting to be relevant is. He paused. It was always a pretense. Let's stop pretending. Aemon said nothing. He felt the weight of that statement land in a way that was not about power or position, but about something more specific, about being seen, fully and without the softening of partiality, by the person whose seeing mattered most. Yes, he said. Aerys took it quietly. That was the thing nobody had quite prepared for. The contingencies had all been built around resistance, around rage, around the particular unpredictable danger of a man with nothing left to lose and fire available. They had Barristan with a full guard. They had Varys tracking the guild. They had the wildfire caches mapped and guarded, with Varys' people in place at each one with instructions. None of it was needed. Aerys sat in the throne room in the late afternoon light with the long shadows falling across the Iron Throne, and Rhaegar told him what the council had decided, and Aerys was quiet for a long time, and then he said, Where is the boy? Rhaegar blinked. Which, Aemon? Aerys said. Your son, where is he? Aemon was in the corridor. He'd been in the corridor the whole time, close enough to move if something went wrong, far enough that the fiction of privacy was maintained. He heard his name. He stepped through the door. Aerys looked at him from the Iron Throne. The light was behind him and his face was in shadow, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like the king he'd been 20 years ago before the rot had taken hold. Something in the set of him, the bones of his face, the absolute stillness. Did you count them? Aerys asked. It took a moment for Aemon to understand what he was asking. Then the swords, 231 swords. The thing they'd spoken about 12 years ago, the 5-year-old boy and his question. No, Aemon said. I never did. I counted them 6 times, Aerys said. 6 times over 12 years. Always 231. He looked at the throne's armrests, those curved blades and sword edges that had cut countless hands of kings. Always the same number, doesn't matter who sits here. No, Aemon said. You're going to sit here eventually, Aerys said, not angry, just observing. Eventually, Aemon said. Aerys looked at him for a long time with his fractured, exhausted eyes. Then he said something that Aemon had not expected and had no preparation for. Be better than I was, he said. You already are. Don't let that change. The room was very still. Rhaegar's face was controlled the way faces are controlled when they're doing the work of holding something that would otherwise break. I'll try, Aemon said. It was the only honest thing to say. He didn't promise, because promises about the future were lies you made in the present to make the present more comfortable. He said he'd try, because trying was the real thing, the thing that took the actual effort, the thing you could mean without deceiving yourself. Aerys nodded. Something went out of him then, Not life, not awareness, but some tension that had been held for years. Some constant state of readiness for attack that had never been able to rest. He looked older and quieter and in some ways more himself than Aemon had seen him in years. "I'd like to go to Dragonstone," Aerys said, to no one in particular. "I'd like to see the sea." Rhaegar's voice, very careful. "That can be arranged." The weeks that followed were the unglamorous work of transition, exactly as Aemon had predicted. He sat in the small council for the first time on a gray morning in early autumn, between Varys and Chelsted, with his father at the head of the table, and the business of the realm arranged in front of them in the organized form of a court that had lurched toward function. He had no formal title yet. That would come with his majority, still months away, but he was there. And the lords of the small council looked at him once with the assessment of men encountering something new in a familiar environment, and then proceeded to talk to him as if he'd always been there, which was the best possible outcome. He was careful in those early meetings. Not tentative. He'd left tentative behind years ago, but precise about when to speak and when to listen, and when to ask questions that directed a conversation without controlling it. The council had its own rhythms and its own dynamics, and he was new to them in the formal sense, and respecting that was both politically sensible and genuinely appropriate. Chelsted surprised him. The man who had been, for years, Aemon's primary bureaucratic obstacle had undergone a shift that had apparently been building since the day he'd argued against the wildfire order. He was still careful, still political, still the kind of man who checked 3 times before committing, but the specific willingness to be pushed around that had made him useful to dangerous people had been replaced by something more spine-like. He challenged things now, raised objections, said no to requests that deserved number. "You were braver than I gave you credit for," Aemon told him after a council session in the second week. Chelsted looked at him with the expression of a man who has been caught receiving a compliment he wasn't expecting. "I spent too long being careful about the wrong things," he said. "Yes," Aemon said, "but you were right when it mattered." Chelsted was quiet for a moment. "I should have been right sooner," he said. "You were 14 when you came to King's Landing and did things I should have been doing for years." He paused. "I found that instructive." "Don't be too hard on yourself," Aemon said. "You were working in worse conditions." Chelsted looked at him with something that was almost wry. "You were working in the same conditions." "I had advantages," Aemon said. "So does every person who succeeds," Chelsted said. "That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what you do with them." Aemon looked at the Lord Steward for a moment, at this small, careful man who had spent a career accommodating power and had found, late, a better use for his skills. "The grain distribution in the Reach," he said. "I've been thinking about the northern routes. There are 3 points of inefficiency in the current system that are costing the crown about 12,000 gold dragons annually." Chelsted blinked. "Show me," he said, with the genuine interest of a man who had found, in the prince's company, an unexpected intellectual engagement. They spent the next 2 hours on grain distribution, and it was one of the more satisfying conversations Aemon had had in weeks. Seasmoke came to King's Landing in the 4th week. Aemon flew her in from Dragonstone on a clear morning, coming in from the seaside where the Blackwater Rush opened into the bay, at an altitude designed to be visible to the whole city. Not theatrical. He genuinely did not have room for theater in his current schedule, but deliberate. The new regime needed its symbols, and the symbol of a Targaryen prince on a dragon over his capital was one of the oldest and most unambiguous in the realm's history. The city stopped. Not in fear. There was some of that, inevitably, but fear was not the primary register. The primary register was something older, something that lived in the bones of a city built by dragon lords, a collective memory that did not require individual knowledge to function. The people of King's Landing looked up at sea smoke banking over the Blackwater and felt something move in them that they could not have named. Aemon felt it from above. He always did. The way the city breathed differently when sea smoke was overhead. The specific texture of 200,000 people responding to something they hadn't expected to feel. He brought her down in the tourney grounds and rode back through the gate of the gods at a walk, which was the correct pace for that particular entrance, and the city watched him the whole way in the particular quiet of something being understood. Robert Baratheon was waiting for him in the outer courtyard, because Robert had arrived the day before for the formal recognition ceremony and had apparently been watching from the battlements with an expression that Ned had described, in a brief message delivered by a smirking squire, as embarrassingly reverential. "That," Robert said when Aemon dismounted, "was the best thing I have ever seen." "She showed off," Aemon said. "That banking turn near the sept was unnecessary." "It was extremely necessary," Robert said firmly. "It was the best part." He clapped Aemon on the shoulder with the force of a small natural disaster. "When do I get to meet her properly?" "Tomorrow morning," Aemon said. "Come to the grounds at dawn. She's better with people before the city wakes up." "People are always better before the city wakes up," Robert said philosophically. He fell into step beside Aemon, and for a moment they walked in comfortable silence, and then Robert said more quietly, "You all right? Ned said it's been a lot." Aemon glanced at him. This was one of the things about Robert that the songs and the stories had consistently failed to capture, the specific quality of his care, when he chose to deploy it. He was large and loud and physically overwhelming, and underneath all of that he paid close attention to the people he considered his, and he asked about them directly. "It's been a lot," Aemon agreed. "Your grandfather," Robert said. Not carefully, Robert didn't do careful, but with a particular directness that was its own form of gentleness. "Did it go all right?" "He asked to see the sea," Aemon said. "He leaves for Dragonstone next week." Robert was quiet for a moment. "That's not bad," he said. "No," Aemon said. "It's not bad." They walked a little further. A pair of sparrows burst out of a hedge ahead of them, startled by something, and wheeled away into the morning sky. Robert watched them go. "I keep thinking about what you said in Winterfell," he said, "about building something worth building. I remember saying it." "I think about it a lot," Robert said. He paused in a way that was unusual for him. Robert was not a man who paused. He moved through silences the way he moved through rooms, which was to say at full speed. This pause was considered. "I want to be part of it, what you're building. I want to be actually useful to it, not just decorative." He paused again. "I know I'm loud." Aemon looked at him. This enormous, vital, complicated young man who had, in another life, been given grief and turned it into ruin, who was, in this life, still the person he'd been before the grief, still capable of the loyalty and the love and the genuine animal joy in living that had always made him magnetic, still reachable. "You're not decorative," Aemon said. "You're the most naturally compelling person I've met. People follow you without being asked to. That's not decoration, that's one of the most politically valuable things in the world when it's pointed in the right direction." Robert blinked. "You're saying I'm politically valuable." "I'm saying you make people want to be part of whatever you're part of," Aemon said, "which means what you choose to be part of matters enormously." He held Robert's gaze. "So choose carefully." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, but it was the shorter, more genuine one, not the room-filling performance. "You're the strangest man I've ever met," he said, "and I've met Ned." "Ned is not strange," Aemon said. "Ned is the clearest person I know." "That's strange," Robert said with absolute conviction. The formal recognition ceremony was 3 days later. The throne room was full, genuinely full this time. Not the political density of a charged situation, but the expansive, golden-lit full of an occasion. The great lords in their best clothes. The small council in their places. the household knights and the ladies, and the visiting lords from halfway across the realm who had ridden south for this specific event, because the specific event was the kind that happened once in a generation. Rhaegar sat in the Iron Throne. Not for the first time. He'd sat in it during council sessions, during audiences, during the practical business of the regency. But this was the first time he'd sat in it with the full weight of formal investiture, with the Maester's documentation and the Lord's endorsements, and the kingdom's recognition assembled and present and witnessed. He looked different in it. Not more kingly. He'd always carried himself with the particular quality that made crowds go quiet, but more settled. Less like a man performing something, and more like a man inhabiting something that had always been there, waiting for the performance to end. Aemon stood with the Crownland's lords to the right of the dais, in the position that was his by blood and birth, and watched his father receive the formal affirmations of the realm's great houses one by one. Rickard Stark, brief, grave, genuine. Tywin Lannister, precise and complete, with the particular weight of a man whose word was known to be worth exactly what he said it was worth, and nothing more and nothing less. Jon Arryn, warm, measured, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this moment and was relieved to have arrived at it. When it was done, Rhaegar looked down from the throne at his son. The look was private in a public room, the look of a man speaking to someone specific through an expression too contained to be overheard. Aemon received it. He nodded once, and his father nodded back, and everything that had passed between them in 18 years, the bewildered wonder, the growing understanding, the arguments and the briefings and the evenings over maps and the mornings in the yard and the specific private language that fathers and sons build between themselves when they're actually paying attention. All of it was in that exchange, complete and acknowledged. Then Rhaegar looked out at the full room, and the moment became public again. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Lyanna Stark arrived. She hadn't been invited to the ceremony. She was 16. She wasn't Lord Rickard's heir. There was no formal reason for her presence at a Lord's Council and a formal investiture. She had apparently described these facts to Lord Rickard in terms that he'd found sufficiently compelling to arrange a visit to King's Landing for his daughter and her brother, and Ned had sent Aemon a raven with the precise flavor of a man reporting circumstances beyond his control. She said if you were building something worth building, she intended to see it in person. I tried to explain the timing. She explained back. Father agreed with her. We arrive in 3 weeks. Aemon had read this raven twice, and then set it down and sat with the warm, complicated feeling it produced for approximately 30 seconds before the next item of business required his attention. She arrived on a Tuesday in a light rain, with Ned and 30 northern riders, and she was taller than he remembered, and exactly the same in every way that mattered. She looked at the Red Keep as they rode in through the gate with the assessing look of someone taking the measure of a place she intends to form an opinion about, and her opinion was apparently mixed, because her face was interested and skeptical in equal measure. She found him that evening in the corridor outside the council chambers, appearing around a corner with the directness of someone who has asked 6 people where you are and is not interested in a preamble. You look tired, she said. Hello, Lyanna, he said. I mean it as an observation, not a criticism, she said. She fell into step beside him because that was apparently where they were going now. Ned said you've been doing the work of 4 people for 3 months. Ned's counting generously, Aemon said. Ned counts conservatively, she said. He would never exaggerate something like that. She glanced at him sideways with those gray eyes that missed nothing. How are you genuinely? Genuinely, he repeated. Not the version you give Barristan or your father or the council, she said. The actual version. He looked at her. In 3 years of letters they had built something, an exchange that was honest in a way that formal correspondence usually wasn't, that had gotten past the social register to the thing underneath. She had that effect, the complete refusal to operate in registers she found insufficient. "I'm good," he said. Genuinely. The shape of things is better than I thought possible." He paused. "There's still a great deal to do. There's always a great deal to do. But the worst of what could have happened didn't happen, and the people I care about are alive and in the right places." He paused again. "That's not nothing. That's everything," she said. They walked in silence for a moment. The corridor was quiet at this hour, the castle settling into its evening routine. Somewhere below them the kitchens were producing smells that indicated dinner was an hour away. "I want to see Seasmoke," Lyanna said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Tourney grounds before the city wakes." "Same time as Robert," he glanced at her. "You knew Robert was here." "Ned told me in the third letter," she said, without a trace of self-consciousness. "I also know that you've been corresponding with him, that you sparred with him in Winterfell and again when you visited Storm's End last spring, and that he told Ned you're the only person he knows who fights like they're thinking about several other things while it's happening." She paused. "He means it as a compliment." "I know," Aemon said. "You've been building something with all of us," she said. Not accusatory, she'd said it before in letters, and each time it had been a statement of approval rather than complaint. "Me and Ned and Robert and the Lannister Lord and all the rest. You've been doing it deliberately for years." "Yes," he said. "Do you trust us?" The question was simple and enormous simultaneously, the way Lyanna's questions always were. She asked things at their actual size, without the social furniture that usually surrounded sensitive topics. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. The corridor was empty around them, the torchlight warm and steady. He thought about trust. About what it actually meant, not the polite word for it, not the performance of it, but the real thing, which was letting people carry weight that mattered, letting them have information that could hurt you if it was misused, letting them be who they were and trusting that who they were was sufficient. He had spent 18 years managing information, managing what he revealed and to whom and how much. Necessary, yes, but it had a cost, and the cost was a specific kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with being known. "Yes," he said. "I trust you." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not surprise exactly, but the look of someone receiving something they'd been waiting to be offered for a while. "Then tell me what you've actually been doing," she said. "Not the version that appears in conversations with great lords. The actual version, all of it." He looked at her. He thought about all the things he hadn't said, the full truth of where his knowledge came from, the memories of a life that hadn't happened, the wall and the long night and the world that had burned in another existence. He thought about how much of it was transferable and how much was simply his to carry, and where the line between those two things was. "Not all of it tonight," he said. "It's a long story, but I'll tell you." He paused. "I'll tell you properly." She nodded once, in the decisive, stark way that meant she'd filed it as a commitment and would hold him to it. "After we see the dragon," she said. "After we see the dragon," he agreed. She was magnificent with Seasmoke. Aemon had expected her to be unafraid. She'd told him she wasn't afraid of much, and she'd been telling the truth about that for 3 years. What he hadn't expected was the specific quality of her fearlessness, which was not bravado and not performance but something simpler and more complete. She looked at Seasmoke the way Seasmoke looked at things she respected, with the frank assessment of one creature evaluating another. Seasmoke looked back. They held each other's gaze for about 10 seconds while Aemon stood to the side and Robert stood slightly further back, making a low noise of amazement that he probably didn't know he was making, and Ned watched with the expression of a man observing something he'll describe to his children. Then Seasmoke head-butted Lyanna. Not hard, not the full weight of it which would have sent a grown man to the ground. A nudge. A probe. A statement. Lyanna stumbled half a step, caught herself, and laughed, the full, complete laugh of someone genuinely delighted, and put her hand flat on the side of Seasmoke's jaw, and Seasmoke made her not quite purr sound and pressed into it. And Aemon watched the two of them and felt something in his chest that was full and uncomplicated and had no agenda in it. "She likes you," he said. "Of course she does," Lyanna said, still laughing. "We're the same." Robert muttered something under his breath that sounded like the most terrifying sentence I've ever heard, and Ned made a small sound of agreement. Aemon looked at the four of them, his people, he thought, with the particular warmth of a man who has arrived somewhere he was trying to reach. In the early morning light of the tourney grounds, a dragon between them and the city just beginning its waking sounds in the distance, and he held the moment. He didn't try to make it mean more than it was. It was just a morning. It was just four people and a dragon in the pale autumn light. But it was also everything he'd spent 18 years building toward. Not the throne, not the regency, not the political architecture, this. People standing together, alive and whole, in a world that was not perfect but was not burning. He let it be enough. That evening he stood on the highest tower of the Red Keep with the wind off the Blackwater rush coming in cold and direct, and he looked out at the city and the bay and the distant smear of the sea beyond. He thought about Jon Snow a lot less than he used to. Not because the memories had faded, they hadn't. They were still there, precise and complete, a life lived in full. But the weight of them had changed. They were not a wound anymore. They were not a warning exactly, though he still used them as one. They were more like a foundation, the specific stone that the person standing on this tower had been built from, the thing that had made him what he was. He was 18 years old. He was the Prince of Dragonstone. He had a dragon, a father who'd learned to listen, a mother who'd known what he was from the beginning and had chosen to stand with it. He had the North and the Westerlands and the Vale in positions that made sense. He had a master of whisperers who trusted him as much as Varys trusted anyone. He had Sir Barristan Selmy, who looked at him sometimes with the expression of a man whose long service had finally found a purpose equal to his honor. He had Ned, who was the most reliable person on the continent. He had Robert, whose loyalty was enormous when it was correctly held. He had Lyanna, who was going to be the most interesting person in any room she walked into for the rest of her life, and who was alive and would remain alive, and who had told him plainly that she trusted him and expected the full story. He would give it to her. Not tonight. Tonight she was learning Seasmoke's preferences and arguing with Robert about something he could hear from 3 towers away and making Ned look fondly exasperated. But soon he'd tell her the real version, and he trusted that she would receive it in the way she received everything, with those gray eyes that looked at things until they told the truth and kept looking after. The wildfire was still in the caches beneath the city. That was the next task, its removal, gradual and careful, under the new authority that the Regency provided. Varys had the map. The work would take months. It would be done. The realm would not be well immediately. Realms didn't become well immediately. They were organic things, large and stubborn and full of people with competing interests and long memories and short tempers. The work of governance was the work of managing that complexity without letting it become catastrophe, and it was slow, and it was frequently inglorious, and it never fully finished. He knew that. He'd always known that. He was going to do it anyway. He pressed his hands flat on the parapet and looked out at everything, the city, the water, the horizon where the sky went dark and the first stars were beginning. And he felt, from somewhere old and deep in him, the specific weight of having done a necessary thing in the world and having done it right. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the particular loneliness of carrying more than you can share, of knowing things that can't be explained, of being strange in ways that made even people who loved you occasionally look at you with the uncertain expression of someone holding something they can't quite identify. But right. Sufficiently, humanly, imperfectly right. The wind came off the water and moved through his silver hair, and Aemon Targaryen stood in the dark on the tower of his father's city and looked at the stars, the same stars that had always been there, and he thought, I did more. He thought it was enough. Below him the city breathed. The ships moved in the harbor. The people went about their lives in their houses and their stalls and their taverns and their beds, not knowing and not needing to know, living the lives that were possible because certain things had not been allowed to burn. Seasmoke's distant cry reached him from the tourney grounds, where she'd refused to be kennelled and was sleeping under the open sky because she was Seasmoke, and she had opinions about where she slept. He smiled. He pushed off the parapet and turned back toward the warm light of the stairwell, back toward the castle and the council and the work and the people and all of it, all the complicated, living, imperfect, ongoing human weight of it. And he walked toward it without hesitation, without fear, with the complete and settled intention of a man who has found the shape of his purpose and has no desire to put it down. The door closed behind him. The stars burned on above the city, indifferent and eternal, and the night held its breath, and somewhere below the streets of King's Landing the caches of wildfire sat cold and dark and still, waiting for the careful hands that would dismantle them, one by one, until they were nothing but old stone and empty chambers, and the ground above them was nothing but ground. It was a beginning. It was enough to begin.